December 31st, 2025. New Year's Eve. Grisly attack kills 38-year-old father outside ski lodge. The winter of 2025 brought unprecedented snowfall to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, with Big Sky Resort recording 43 inches in the final week of December alone. For James Michael Whitaker, a 38-year-old financial advisor from Denver, Colorado, the abundance of powder snow represented the perfect culmination to what had been a challenging year. His wife, Sarah Elizabeth Whitaker, 35, a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital Colorado, had suggested the family trip as a way to reconnect after months of financial stress and marital tension. Their children, Emma Rose, 12, and Lucas James, 9, had been looking forward to the New Year's Eve celebration at Big Sky Resort for weeks, their excitement building as they counted down the days on a handmade calendar Emma had decorated with silver stars and gold glitter. The Whitaker family had arrived at Big Sky Resort on December 28th, checking into a 2-bedroom suite at the Summit Hotel, located at the base of Lone Mountain. James had booked the accommodation through his company's corporate travel program, securing a discounted rate that made the trip financially feasible despite their recent struggles. The suite featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the resort's main plaza, where crews were already assembling the stage for the New Year's Eve celebration. Sarah had insisted on a room with a view, remembering how her own father had taken their family to similar destinations during her childhood in Minnesota, creating memories that sustained her through difficult times. The resort itself sprawled across 11,000 acres of pristine Montana wilderness, situated in the Madison Range, approximately 50 miles south of Bozeman. Big Sky Resort had evolved from a small ski area founded by legendary broadcaster Chet Huntley in the 1970s into one of North America's largest ski resorts, featuring over 5,800 acres of skiable terrain across 4 interconnected mountains. The Summit Hotel, where the Whitaker family stayed, stood as the resort's flagship accommodation, a 7-story structure of timber and stone that seamlessly blended with the surrounding landscape while offering luxury amenities to affluent visitors from across the country. During their first 3 days at the resort, the Whitaker family established a comfortable routine that allowed each member to pursue their interests while maintaining family cohesion. James, an intermediate skier who had learned the sport during college years at the University of Colorado, preferred the groomed intermediate runs on Andesite Mountain, particularly the Morning Star and Bighorn trails that offered spectacular views of the Spanish Peaks and Gallatin Range. He typically departed for his first run at 8:30 each morning, after sharing breakfast with his family in the hotel's restaurant, returning to meet them for lunch at the Mid-Mountain Lodge. Sarah, a more cautious skier who had only taken up the sport after meeting James 15 years earlier, confined herself primarily to the beginner slopes near the base area, often skiing with other parents while their children attended ski school. She particularly enjoyed the White Wing and Easy Rider trails, which provided gentle descents through stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, while offering multiple opportunities to rest and observe the surrounding wilderness. Her nursing background had made her acutely aware of the risks inherent in mountain sports, and she insisted on wearing a helmet at all times, despite James's occasional teasing about her cautious approach. Emma, despite her young age, demonstrated natural athletic ability and fearlessness that impressed her instructors. She quickly progressed from the bunny hill to intermediate terrain, joining a group of similarly skilled young skiers for daily lessons that culminated in runs down Lone Wolf and Elk Park Ridge. Her instructor, Patricia "Patty" Morrison, a 26-year-old from Park City, Utah, who had been teaching at Big Sky for 4 seasons, noted Emma's exceptional balance and spatial awareness, qualities that suggested she could develop into an advanced skier with proper instruction and practice. Lucas, more tentative than his sister but equally determined, focused on mastering fundamental techniques under the patient guidance of his instructor, Michael Mike Chen, a 32-year-old former racer from Aspen who specialized in working with younger children. Mike had developed a teaching methodology that emphasized fun over technique in the early stages, using games and challenges to build confidence before introducing more complex skills. Lucas responded well to this approach, gaining sufficient proficiency during their stay to attempt green-level runs independently by December 30th. The weather during their stay had been exceptionally favorable for skiing, with morning temperatures ranging from 15 to 25 degrees Fahrenheit and abundant sunshine that created spectacular visibility across the resort's terrain. However, the extended period of clear, cold weather had also created conditions that wildlife biologists later identified as contributing factors to the tragedy that would unfold on New Year's Eve. The deep snowpack, while excellent for skiing, had made foraging extremely difficult for the region's wildlife, particularly the grizzly bears that should have been hibernating, but remained active due to unseasonably warm temperatures earlier in the fall. Dr. Margaret Maggie Thompson, a wildlife biologist with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, who had been monitoring grizzly bear activity in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem for 12 years, had noted unusual patterns of behavior throughout the late fall and early winter of 2025. Several adult grizzlies, including a large male designated as Bear 274 by her research team, had failed to enter hibernation on their typical schedule, remaining active well into December as they searched for food sources to sustain them through the winter months. Bear 274, estimated to weigh between 600 and 700 pounds, had been observed multiple times in the vicinity of Big Sky Resort during December, prompting Dr. Thompson to issue advisories to resort management regarding proper food storage and waste management protocols. Resort management, under the leadership of General Manager David Patrick O'Sullivan, a 51-year-old hospitality veteran with 23 years of experience in mountain resort operations, had implemented standard bear safety protocols throughout the property. These measures included bear-proof dumpsters located in designated collection areas, strict guidelines for restaurant food waste disposal, and regular patrols by the resort's security team to ensure compliance with wildlife safety regulations. However, the unprecedented number of visitors during the holiday period, combined with the large-scale New Year's Eve celebration being planned, had stretched these protocols to their limits. The New Year's Eve celebration at Big Sky Resort had been marketed as the largest outdoor winter party in Montana, with organizers expecting over 3,000 guests to attend the evening's festivities. The event planning committee, headed by marketing director Jennifer Jen Louise Hamilton, a 39-year-old former event coordinator from Vail, Colorado, had spent 6 months organizing the celebration, which would feature live music, professional fireworks displays, and multiple food and beverage stations throughout the resort's base area. The scale of the event required extensive coordination with local authorities, including the Gallatin County Sheriff's Department and the Big Sky Fire Department, to ensure adequate security and emergency response capabilities. By December 31st, resort personnel had completed the installation of 3 main staging areas for the celebration. The primary stage, located in the center of the main plaza, featured a professional sound system capable of projecting music and announcements across the entire base area. 2 secondary stages, positioned near the Summit Hotel and the Mountain Mall, provided additional entertainment venues and helped distribute the crowd across a larger area. Professional lighting technicians had installed specialized fixtures throughout the plaza, creating a festive atmosphere while maintaining adequate visibility for security personnel and emergency responders. The fireworks display, contracted through Rocky Mountain Pyrotechnics of Billings, Montana, represented the celebration's centerpiece, with over 2,000 individual charges scheduled for deployment in a 12-minute sequence beginning at midnight. Pyrotechnician supervisor Robert Bob Eugene Martinez, a 44-year-old veteran with 18 years of experience in large-scale displays, had personally overseen the installation of the firing system on December 30th, positioning launch tubes on the roof of the Summit Hotel and coordinating timing sequences with the resort's sound system operators. Weather conditions on December 31st appeared ideal for the outdoor celebration, with clear skies, light winds from the southwest, and a temperature of 22 degrees Fahrenheit at 6 o'clock in the evening when the festivities officially began. The National Weather Service forecast called for continued clear conditions throughout the night, with temperatures dropping to approximately 10 degrees by midnight and no precipitation expected. Visibility was excellent, with a nearly full moon providing natural illumination that complemented the artificial lighting installed throughout the resort. The Whitaker family had spent December 31st skiing together as a group, taking advantage of excellent snow conditions and shorter lift lines as many resort guests prepared for the evening celebration. They met for lunch at the Lone Peak Perk, a mid-mountain cafe located at the base of the Lone Peak Tram, where they shared hamburgers, French fries, and hot chocolate while discussing their plans for the New Year's Eve party. Emma expressed excitement about staying up until midnight for the first time, while Lucas worried that he might fall asleep before the fireworks began. James had initially suggested they watch the celebration from their hotel room, citing concerns about the cold temperatures and large crowds. But Sarah convinced him that the experience would create lasting memories for their children. She reminded him of similar family celebrations from her childhood, particularly a New Year's Eve party at a resort in northern Minnesota, where she first saw professional fireworks at age 10, an experience that remained vivid in her memory 30 years later. James ultimately agreed, though he insisted they dress warmly and position themselves near the hotel entrance to facilitate a quick retreat indoors if the children became uncomfortable. After finishing their final ski runs at 3:30 in the afternoon, the family returned to their hotel suite to rest and prepare for the evening's festivities. Sarah ran a hot bath for the children, while James reviewed the celebration schedule provided by the hotel concierge, noting that the main entertainment would begin at 9 o'clock, with local band performances continuing until the midnight countdown. The fireworks display would commence immediately after midnight, followed by an after-party in the hotel's ballroom, featuring a DJ and dancing until 3 o'clock in the morning. The family shared dinner at the hotel's restaurant, the Summit House, at 6:30, ordering comfort foods that would provide sustained energy for the long evening ahead. James selected the elk medallions with wild mushroom risotto, while Sarah chose the pan-seared trout with roasted vegetables. Emma and Lucas both ordered chicken tenders and French fries, though Emma also requested a small Caesar salad, demonstrating her growing sophistication in food choices. They lingered over dessert, sharing a chocolate lava cake and discussing their favorite moments from the ski trip. By 8:15, the family had returned to their suite to change into warm clothing suitable for extended outdoor exposure. Sarah had researched appropriate winter clothing extensively before the trip, purchasing insulated boots, thermal underwear, and waterproof outer layers for each family member. She insisted they dress in layers, beginning with moisture-wicking base layers, followed by insulating fleece or down garments, and topped with windproof and waterproof shells. James initially complained about the bulk of the clothing, but acknowledged its necessity given the forecasted temperatures. The transformation of the resort's base area throughout the evening created a magical atmosphere that impressed even James, who typically remained skeptical of large-scale tourist events. Professional lighting designers had installed thousands of LED fixtures that created patterns of color across the snow, while sound technicians tested microphones and speakers in preparation for the live entertainment. Food vendors had set up stations offering hot beverages, roasted chestnuts, and other warming treats, creating aromatic clouds that mingled with the crisp mountain air. By 9 o'clock, when the family joined the growing crowd in the main plaza, approximately 800 guests had already gathered for the celebration, with arrivals continuing steadily as the evening progressed. Resort security personnel, identifiable by their bright yellow jackets and radio equipment, maintained visible positions throughout the area, monitoring crowd behavior and ensuring compliance with safety regulations. The atmosphere remained festive and family-friendly, with children building snowmen near the edges of the plaza, while adults socialized around the beverage stations. The first musical act, a bluegrass quartet called Mountain Echo from Bozeman, took the stage at 9:15, performing energetic versions of traditional songs that encouraged audience participation. Emma and Lucas initially remained close to their parents, but gradually joined other children in an impromptu dance area near the secondary stage, their inhibitions dissolved by the festive atmosphere and the excitement of being awake far past their normal bedtime. Sarah captured numerous photographs with her smartphone, documenting the children's joy and the spectacular mountain backdrop illuminated by the professional lighting. James found himself surprisingly enjoying the celebration, despite his initial reluctance to participate. The combination of live music, beautiful surroundings, and his family's obvious happiness created a sense of well-being that had been absent during much of the challenging previous year. He struck up conversations with other parents, sharing experiences about skiing with children and comparing notes about different resorts they had visited. One conversation partner, Dr. William Bill Harrison, a cardiologist from Phoenix, Arizona, had brought his family to Big Sky for 7 consecutive years and provided recommendations for restaurants and activities they should try during future visits. The second musical act, an alternative rock band called Elevation from Missoula, began their set at 10:30, generating higher energy levels that appealed particularly to the younger adults in the audience. The volume increased significantly, requiring parents to position themselves closer to their children to maintain communication. Sarah expressed mild concern about the sound levels, but Emma and Lucas seemed energized rather than bothered by the music, joining larger groups of children who had gathered near the stage area. As the evening progressed, the crowd continued to grow, reaching an estimated 2,000 people by 11 o'clock. Resort staff circulated throughout the area, distributing complimentary noisemakers, party hats, and temporary tattoos featuring the Big Sky logo. Security personnel increased their patrols, paying particular attention to alcohol consumption and monitoring the behavior of guests who appeared to be struggling with the effects of altitude and cold temperatures. Emergency medical technicians, stationed in a heated trailer near the main stage, treated several minor cases of frostbite and alcohol-related issues, but encountered no serious problems. The pre-midnight entertainment concluded at 11:45 with a brief fireworks preview that sent several colorful charges into the clear night sky, generating enthusiastic cheers from the crowd and building anticipation for the main display. Resort management used the break in entertainment to provide safety announcements over the public address system, reminding guests to stay within designated areas during the fireworks display and to report any emergencies immediately to security personnel. At 11:50, resort staff distributed champagne to adults and sparkling cider to children, preparing for the traditional midnight toast that would accompany the countdown. The crowd had reached its peak size, with resort officials later estimating attendance at approximately 2,800 guests, slightly below the anticipated maximum, but representing the largest New Year's Eve celebration in the resort's history. The atmosphere reached a crescendo of excitement as families gathered together in anticipation of the countdown and fireworks display. James positioned his family near the main entrance to the Summit Hotel, approximately 50 yards from the central stage, providing them with an excellent view of the fireworks launch area, while maintaining easy access to the building's warmth and restroom facilities. He had scouted the location earlier in the evening, noting that it offered protection from the prevailing wind while avoiding the most congested areas of the plaza. Sarah spread a waterproof blanket on the snow, creating a defined space for their family group and providing insulation from the frozen ground. The final countdown began at 11:59 and 30 seconds, with the crowd joining together in a thunderous chant that could be heard throughout the base area and beyond. Emma and Lucas held hands with their parents, their faces bright with excitement and anticipation as they participated in their first midnight New Year's celebration. Sarah captured video footage of the countdown, planning to share it with extended family members who were celebrating the new year in their respective time zones. At exactly midnight, as the crowd reached the climactic Happy New Year cheer, the first charges of the fireworks display launched from the Summit Hotel rooftop, sending brilliant streams of colored light across the star-filled Montana sky. The display began with a series of golden chrysanthemum bursts that illuminated the surrounding mountain peaks, creating a spectacular backdrop that prompted gasps of admiration from the assembled guests. James wrapped his arms around his family, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for the moment and optimism about the year ahead. The fireworks continued with increasing intensity, featuring complex sequences of multiple colors and patterns that had been choreographed to coincide with triumphant music broadcast through the sound system. Professional photographers from the resort's marketing department captured images of the celebration, while numerous guests documented the experience with smartphones and cameras. The combination of artificial illumination from the fireworks and natural moonlight created visibility conditions that allowed clear observation of the surrounding area, extending several hundred yards beyond the main plaza. It was during the fireworks display's peak intensity, approximately 3 minutes after midnight, that several guests in the outer areas of the crowd first noticed movement in the tree line that bordered the northern edge of the plaza. The dark shape moving among the lodgepole pines initially attracted little attention, as most observers assumed it was a member of the resort's security team or maintenance staff conducting routine patrols. However, Dr. Elizabeth Liz Ann Cooper, a veterinarian from Seattle, Washington, who had positioned herself with her family near the Mountain Mall, recognized the distinctive gait and size profile that indicated a large bear approaching the celebration area. Dr. Cooper immediately attempted to alert nearby security personnel, but her warnings were overwhelmed by the noise of the fireworks display and the crowd's enthusiastic responses to the aerial show. She left her family's position and began moving toward the nearest security officer, approximately 30 yards away, but the density of the crowd and the distraction created by the fireworks prevented her from making rapid progress. Meanwhile, the bear continued its approach, moving steadily through the scattered pine trees that provided partial concealment as it advanced toward the concentrated human activity. Bear 274, the large male grizzly that Dr. Thompson's research team had been monitoring throughout the fall and early winter, had been attracted to the Big Sky Resort area by the combination of food odors emanating from the celebration and the unusual levels of human activity occurring during his normal foraging hours. The bear's delayed hibernation, caused by insufficient fat reserves accumulated during the previous fall, had left him in a state of chronic hunger that overrode his natural tendency to avoid human contact. The sensory overload created by the fireworks display, combined with the bear's stressed physiological condition, contributed to his decision to continue approaching rather than retreating to a safer distance. Wildlife behavior specialists who later analyzed the incident noted that several factors converged to create an unprecedented situation that challenged standard bear safety protocols. The large crowd size prevented the implementation of normal noise-based deterrent strategies, while the fireworks display created visual and auditory conditions that interfered with both human awareness and bear communication signals. Additionally, the bear's extended period without proper nutrition had altered his normal behavioral patterns, making him more likely to take risks in pursuit of potential food sources. At 12:03 a.m., as the fireworks display continued with a sequence of red and white bursts designed to evoke patriotic themes, the bear emerged from the tree line approximately 100 yards north of the main plaza. Several guests noticed the large dark shape moving across the snow-covered open area, but initial reactions were confused rather than alarmed, as many observers initially mistook the bear for a large dog or possibly a horse that had wandered away from nearby ranch properties. The bear's size and distinctive movement pattern became more apparent as it approached the edge of the crowd, but by that time, its proximity to human beings had made the situation extremely dangerous. James Whitaker first became aware of the bear's presence when he noticed other guests near their position beginning to point and whisper among themselves, their attention divided between the fireworks display overhead and something occurring at ground level. He followed their gaze and initially saw only a large dark shape moving slowly through the crowd's periphery, approximately 20 yards to their north. His first assumption was that resort personnel were moving equipment or that a maintenance vehicle was operating in the area, but as he continued to observe, the distinctive characteristics of a large bear became unmistakable. Sarah noticed her husband's changed demeanor and followed his gaze, immediately recognizing the danger posed by the bear's proximity to their family and the surrounding crowd. Her nursing background had included training in emergency response protocols, and she immediately began mentally rehearsing the appropriate actions for bear encounters while simultaneously assessing potential escape routes and shelter options. However, the density of the surrounding crowd and their distance from the hotel entrance complicated any plans for immediate evacuation. The bear continued its approach, moving deliberately but not aggressively toward the concentrated group of celebration participants. Wildlife experts later determined that the bear was likely investigating the area for food sources rather than displaying territorial or predatory behavior, but his size and proximity created an inherently dangerous situation that required immediate intervention by trained personnel. Unfortunately, the combination of crowd noise, fireworks distraction, and the unprecedented nature of the situation prevented resort security from recognizing and responding to the threat until the bear was already within the crowd's immediate vicinity. At 12:04 a.m., Dr. Cooper finally reached Security Officer Thomas "Tom" Martinez, a 34-year-old former military police officer with 6 years of experience in resort security operations. Despite the noise from the fireworks and crowd, she managed to communicate the presence of the bear and its approximate location. Officer Martinez immediately contacted the Resort Security Command Center via radio, requesting additional personnel and initiating the emergency response protocols that had been developed for wildlife encounters, though none of the existing protocols had anticipated a situation involving a large bear in the midst of a crowd of thousands of people. Security Supervisor Janet "Jan" Louise Peterson, monitoring the celebration from the command center located in the Summit Hotel's lower level, received Officer Martinez's report at 12:04 and 37 seconds a.m. She immediately contacted Big Sky Fire Chief Robert "Rob" Allen Johnson and Gallatin County Sheriff's Deputy Michael "Mike" Thompson, both of whom were on duty at the resort as part of the enhanced security presence for the New Year's Eve celebration. However, the complexity of the situation, combined with the ongoing fireworks display that prevented clear communication and crowd management, created unprecedented challenges for emergency response personnel. James Whitaker made the decision to move his family toward the hotel entrance, recognizing that their current position left them exposed if the bear's behavior became more aggressive. He quietly informed Sarah of his intentions, and they began gathering their belongings while attempting to avoid sudden movements that might attract the bear's attention. Emma and Lucas, still mesmerized by the fireworks display, initially resisted their parents' efforts to relocate, requiring gentle but insistent persuasion to comply with the family's movement towards safety. The bear, now approximately 15 yards from the Whitaker family's position, paused in its movement and appeared to be assessing the situation, turning its massive head to survey the surrounding area, while remaining alert to the various sounds and smells emanating from the crowd. This momentary pause created a false sense of security among some observers, who interpreted the bear's stillness as evidence that it posed no immediate threat and might simply retreat back to the forest. However, wildlife behaviorists later explained that this pause likely represented the bear's evaluation of potential threats and opportunities rather than a signal of non-aggressive intentions. As the fireworks display reached its grand finale at 12:05 a.m., featuring a rapid sequence of multiple colors and patterns, accompanied by especially loud, explosive charges, the sensory overload appeared to agitate the bear, causing it to resume movement in the direction of the densest part of the crowd. The bear's path would intersect with the area where the Whitaker family was positioned, though James's decision to move toward the hotel entrance had created some distance between their location and the bear's apparent trajectory. Security personnel had managed to position themselves at strategic locations around the bear's perimeter, but their options for intervention remained limited by the presence of civilians in all directions. Standard wildlife management protocols called for the use of noisemakers, bright lights, and coordinated human presence to encourage bears to retreat from human contact areas. But the ongoing fireworks display and crowd concentration made it impossible to implement these strategies without potentially creating panic that could result in injuries from crowd stampede behavior. The first indication that the situation was escalating beyond manageable parameters occurred when the bear suddenly accelerated its movement, breaking into a loping gait that carried it directly toward the area where James Whitaker was attempting to guide his family to safety. The bear's change in behavior may have been triggered by the fireworks finale's particularly loud explosions, or it may have detected specific food odors or sounds that attracted its attention. But wildlife experts noted that hungry bears in stressful situations often display unpredictable behavior patterns that challenge conventional management approaches. James realized that the bear's trajectory would bring it into direct contact with their family group within seconds, and he made the instantaneous decision to position himself between the bear and his wife and children. This protective instinct, while admirable from a familial standpoint, placed him in the most dangerous possible position relative to the approaching grizzly bear. Sarah, recognizing her husband's intentions, began moving Emma and Lucas more rapidly toward the hotel entrance, while calling out warnings to other families in their immediate vicinity. The bear reached the Whitaker family's location at 12:05 and 42 seconds a.m., just as the fireworks display concluded with a spectacular burst of gold and silver charges that illuminated the entire plaza with brilliant white light. In that moment of maximum visibility, hundreds of celebration guests witnessed the beginning of an attack that would forever change their understanding of wilderness safety and the unpredictable nature of wildlife encounters in developed recreational areas. James Whitaker's final conscious decision was to step directly into the bear's path while shouting warnings to his family and the surrounding crowd. The bear, startled by James's sudden movement and vocalizations, reared up on its hind legs to a height estimated at nearly 9 feet, displaying the full extent of its massive size and physical power. For a moment that seemed frozen in time, man and bear faced each other in a confrontation that represented the collision of human, recreational activities with the brutal realities of nature's food chain. The attack began when the bear dropped back to all 4 legs and struck James with its right front paw, a blow that knocked him to the ground and inflicted severe lacerations across his chest and shoulder area. The bear's claws, each measuring approximately 4 inches in length, penetrated through James's winter clothing and created wounds that immediately began bleeding profusely onto the snow. Sarah's screams combined with the shouts of nearby witnesses to create a cacophony of human distress that finally began to alert the broader crowd to the emergency occurring in their midst. Bear attacks typically occur with shocking speed, and the encounter between Bear 274 and James Whitaker followed this pattern, with the initial contact leading rapidly to a sustained assault that demonstrated the enormous physical advantages possessed by grizzly bears in close-quarters confrontations with human beings. After knocking James to the ground, the bear immediately pressed its attack, using its weight and momentum to pin its victim, while delivering additional strikes with both front paws and attempting to bite James's head and neck area. James's winter clothing provided some protection against the bear's claws and teeth, but the garments were designed for cold weather protection rather than defense against predator attacks, and they quickly began to fail under the intensity of the bear's assault. His insulated jacket and underlying layers were shredded within seconds, exposing his skin to direct contact with the bear's weapons and the sub-freezing air temperature. Blood from his wounds created dark stains on the snow that were visible even in the limited lighting conditions following the conclusion of the fireworks display. Sarah Whitaker's nursing training included basic knowledge of trauma response, but nothing in her professional experience had prepared her for witnessing her husband being attacked by a wild animal. Her immediate instincts focused on protecting Emma and Lucas while simultaneously seeking help for James, but the unprecedented nature of the situation created conflicts between these priorities that made effective response nearly impossible. She continued moving the children toward the hotel entrance while screaming for help, hoping that resort security or emergency medical personnel would respond quickly enough to save her husband's life. Emma and Lucas Whitaker's psychological trauma began at the moment they witnessed their father's attack, creating emotional wounds that would require extensive therapy and support in the months and years following the incident. Emma, at 12 years old, possessed sufficient cognitive development to understand the severity of the situation and the implications for her family's future, while Lucas, at 9, struggled to comprehend the reality of what he was witnessing. Both children would later require specialized counseling to address post-traumatic stress disorder and related psychological complications stemming from their New Year's Eve experience. Security Officer Martinez, who had been attempting to coordinate with other personnel for a safe intervention strategy, found himself forced to take immediate action when the bear's attack on James Whitaker began. He drew his service weapon, a 9mm pistol, and began moving closer to the attack site while attempting to acquire a clear shot that would not endanger civilians in the vicinity. However, the bear's position relative to James and the presence of other people in the background made it extremely difficult to safely discharge his weapon without risking additional casualties. Dr. Cooper, whose veterinary training provided her with extensive knowledge of large animal behavior and physiology, attempted to assist the security response by using noise-making techniques designed to distract the bear and potentially encourage it to discontinue its attack. She began shouting and clapping her hands while slowly approaching the scene, hoping to draw the bear's attention away from James without triggering a secondary attack on herself or other bystanders. However, the bear's intense focus on its victim and its physiologically aroused state made it unlikely to respond to standard deterrent methods. The bear continued its assault on James for approximately 90 seconds, a duration that seemed far longer to the witnesses who were forced to observe the attack while feeling helpless to intervene effectively. During this period, the bear delivered multiple strikes with its front paws, inflicted several bite wounds on James's torso and limbs, and used its weight to prevent any attempts at escape or resistance. James's consciousness during the attack varied, with periods of awareness alternating with episodes of unconsciousness caused by blood loss, shock, and the physical trauma of the bear's assault. Resort guests who witnessed the attack later described a range of reactions that reflected the psychological impact of observing extreme violence in a setting associated with family recreation and celebration. Some individuals immediately began recording the incident with their smartphones, creating documentation that would later prove valuable for wildlife management investigations, but also contributing to the viral spread of traumatic imagery across social media platforms. Others attempted to help by shouting warnings or throwing objects at the bear, though these efforts were largely ineffective and may have prolonged the attack by further agitating the animal. The first successful intervention occurred when Security Supervisor Peterson arrived at the scene with a shotgun loaded with rubber slugs, non-lethal ammunition designed to discourage aggressive wildlife without causing permanent injury or death. She fired 2 rounds at the bear from a distance of approximately 20 yards, striking it in the hindquarters and causing sufficient pain and surprise to interrupt its attack on James. The bear immediately turned toward this new threat, providing the first opportunity for potential rescue efforts since the attack had begun. However, the bear's response to being shot with rubber slugs demonstrated the unpredictable nature of wildlife encounters and the limitations of non-lethal deterrent methods when dealing with large predators in highly stressed conditions. Rather than retreating as hoped, Bear 274 became more agitated and began moving towards Supervisor Peterson, potentially expanding the dangerous situation to include additional human targets. This development forced security personnel to escalate their response protocols and consider the use of lethal force to protect both the original victim and other people in the immediate area. Fire Chief Johnson arrived at the scene at 12:07 a.m., approximately 90 seconds after the attack began, bringing additional personnel and emergency medical equipment that would be essential for treating James's injuries if the bear could be successfully deterred. His team included emergency medical technicians Patricia Pat Williams and David Dave Rodriguez, both of whom had extensive experience treating trauma cases, but had never encountered injuries inflicted by wild animal attacks. They positioned themselves at a safe distance from the ongoing confrontation while preparing medical supplies and planning their approach for treating James once the scene could be secured. Deputy Sheriff Thompson, who possessed specialized training in wildlife management and had participated in previous bear encounters throughout his 8-year career with the Gallatin County Sheriff's Department, made the decision to use lethal force when the bear began approaching Supervisor Peterson after she had fired the rubber slugs. He drew his service rifle, a .308 caliber weapon capable of delivering sufficient stopping power to neutralize a large grizzly bear, and fired 2 rounds center mass into the bear's chest cavity from a distance of approximately 15 yards. The rifle round struck Bear 274 with devastating effect, causing massive internal trauma that resulted in immediate incapacitation and death within seconds. The bear collapsed approximately 3 yards from James Whitaker's position, ending the attack, but leaving behind a scene of carnage that would haunt witnesses and first responders for years to come. The sudden silence that followed the rifle shots created an eerie contrast to the preceding minutes of violence and chaos, allowing the full extent of the tragedy to become apparent to everyone present. Emergency medical personnel immediately rushed to James's side, beginning treatment for what they quickly recognized as life-threatening injuries, requiring immediate evacuation to a trauma center capable of handling complex surgical cases. EMT Williams performed an initial assessment that revealed multiple deep lacerations across James's chest, arms and back, several potential bite wounds on his torso, and signs of significant blood loss that indicated the need for emergency transfusion and surgical intervention. EMT Rodriguez established intravenous access and began fluid resuscitation while simultaneously coordinating with life flight helicopter services for medical evacuation. Sarah Whitaker, who had successfully moved Emma and Lucas to safety inside the Summit Hotel lobby, emerged once the scene was secured and was allowed to approach her critically injured husband. The sight of James lying unconscious in a pool of blood on the snow, surrounded by emergency medical personnel working frantically to stabilize his condition, created a psychological trauma that would affect her for the remainder of her life. She struggled to maintain composure for the sake of her children, while simultaneously trying to process the magnitude of what had occurred and its implications for their family's future. The medical evacuation helicopter, operated by Eagle County paramedics based in Vail, Colorado, arrived at Big Sky Resort at 12:32 a.m., landing in a cleared area of the main plaza that had been hastily prepared by resort personnel using snowplows and lighting equipment. The flight crew, consisting of pilot captain Jennifer Jen Thompson, flight nurse Maria Santos, and flight medic Robert Rob Clark, had extensive experience with trauma cases, but acknowledged that animal attack injuries presented unique challenges requiring specialized treatment protocols. James's condition during the helicopter flight to Bozeman Deaconess Hospital remained critical, with medical personnel working continuously to maintain his blood pressure, control bleeding, and prevent the onset of shock that could prove fatal before surgical intervention could begin. Flight nurse Santos later described the flight as one of the most challenging cases of her career, requiring constant adjustment of treatment protocols as James's condition fluctuated throughout the 40-minute transport to the hospital's trauma center. The trauma team at Bozeman Deaconess Hospital, led by Dr. Richard Rick Thompson, a thoracic surgeon with 15 years of experience treating complex chest injuries, had been alerted to the incoming patient's condition and was prepared for immediate surgical intervention upon James's arrival. The hospital's trauma bay was equipped with advanced life support systems and surgical facilities capable of handling multiple simultaneous procedures, resources that would prove essential given the extensive nature of James's injuries. Dr. Thompson's initial assessment revealed that James had sustained multiple deep lacerations that had severed several major blood vessels, causing significant internal bleeding that required immediate surgical repair. Additionally, the bear's bite wounds had created puncture injuries that penetrated into the chest cavity, potentially compromising lung function and creating risk of infection from bacteria present in the bear's mouth. The surgical team worked for over 6 hours to repair damaged blood vessels, remove contaminated tissue, and stabilize James's vital signs. Despite the medical team's extensive efforts, James Whitaker's injuries proved too severe to overcome, and he was pronounced dead at 6:47 a.m. on January 1st, 2026, approximately 6.5 hours after the bear attack occurred. Dr. Thompson later stated that the combination of massive blood loss, extensive tissue damage, and the stress placed on James's cardiovascular system by the attack had created injuries that were ultimately incompatible with survival. Despite the rapid response of emergency services and the availability of advanced medical care, The news of James's death was communicated to Sarah Whitaker by hospital chaplain Mary Catherine O'Brien, a Catholic nun with 23 years of experience providing spiritual support to families experiencing traumatic loss. Sarah's reaction to learning of her husband's death was described by hospital staff as devastating but remarkably composed, as she immediately focused on the need to inform Emma and Lucas of their father's death and to make arrangements for returning to Colorado with his body. Emma and Lucas had spent the early morning hours in the hospital's family waiting area under the supervision of child life specialist Amanda Amy Richardson, a trained professional who specialized in helping children cope with medical crises affecting their families. Richardson had used play therapy and age-appropriate communication techniques to help the children understand what was happening with their father while avoiding graphic details that could compound their psychological trauma. The task of informing Emma and Lucas of their father's death fell to Sarah, who chose to communicate the news in a private family room with the support of Chaplain O'Brien and child life specialist Richardson. Emma's response demonstrated her growing maturity and understanding of death's finality, while Lucas initially struggled to comprehend that his father would not be returning home with them. Both children would require extensive counseling and support services in the months following the tragedy. The investigation into the bear attack began immediately, with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks dispatching a team of wildlife biologists and law enforcement officers to Big Sky Resort to examine the scene and collect evidence that would help determine the factors contributing to the incident. The investigation team was led by Dr. Thompson, the same wildlife biologist who had been monitoring Bear 274 throughout the fall and winter, giving her unique insights into the animal's behavior patterns and physical condition. Dr. Thompson's preliminary examination of Bear 274's carcass revealed that the bear was significantly underweight for its size and age, confirming that inadequate nutrition had likely contributed to its decision to approach the resort area during the New Year's Eve celebration. The bear's stomach contents included evidence of human food waste, indicating that it had been feeding on improperly stored or disposed materials in the days leading up to the attack, potentially creating a behavioral pattern that made the tragedy more likely to occur. The necropsy performed on Bear 274 by veterinary pathologist Dr. James Wilson at Montana State University revealed additional information about the bear's physical condition and the circumstances that led to its presence at Big Sky Resort. The bear's fat reserves were found to be approximately 30% below normal levels for a grizzly of its size preparing for hibernation, creating a physiological stress that would have driven it to continue foraging, despite the risks associated with human contact. Resort management faced immediate scrutiny regarding their wildlife safety protocols and the adequacy of measures taken to prevent bear encounters during large-scale events. General Manager O'Sullivan convened emergency meetings with the resort's leadership team and legal counsel to address liability concerns and develop appropriate responses to media inquiries and potential litigation arising from the incident. The resort's insurance carriers were notified immediately, beginning a claims process that would eventually result in multi-million-dollar settlements with the Whitaker family. The legal implications of the bear attack extended beyond civil liability to include potential criminal charges if investigators determined that negligence or willful violations of safety regulations had contributed to James's death. Montana Attorney General Patricia "Pat" Morrison assigned a special prosecutor to review the case and determine whether criminal charges were warranted against resort personnel, wildlife management officials, or other parties who may have failed in their duty to protect public safety. Media coverage of the bear attack began within hours of the incident, as guests who had witnessed the attack shared photographs and video footage through social media platforms, creating viral content that attracted national and international attention. News organizations from across the country dispatched reporters to Big Sky Resort to cover the story, creating a media circus that complicated the investigation and added to the stress experienced by the Whitaker family and other witnesses to the attack. The first major news report appeared on NBC's Today Show on the morning of January 1st, featuring an interview with Dr. Cooper, who had first spotted the bear's approach toward the celebration. Her account provided viewers with a detailed description of the events leading up to the attack and the challenges faced by security personnel attempting to manage an unprecedented situation involving a large predator in the midst of a crowded celebration. CNN's coverage focused on the broader implications of the attack for wildlife management policies in areas where human development intersects with critical habitat for large predators. Their reports featured interviews with wildlife biologists and policy experts who discussed the increasing frequency of bear-human conflicts in the Rocky Mountain region and the challenges associated with balancing recreational development with conservation of wildlife populations. Fox News emphasized the personal tragedy experienced by the Whitaker family and the heroic actions of James in attempting to protect his wife and children from the attacking bear. Their coverage included interviews with family friends and colleagues who described James as a devoted father and husband who would not hesitate to sacrifice himself for his family's safety, reinforcing the narrative of his death as the result of paternal instincts rather than poor decision-making. Social media platforms became venues for intense debate about wildlife management policies, with some users advocating for more aggressive approaches to controlling bear populations near recreational areas, while others argued for restrictions on human development in critical wildlife habitat. The viral nature of video footage from the attack created traumatic viewing experiences for millions of people who encountered the graphic content without warning, leading to calls for better content moderation policies on social media platforms. The psychological impact of witnessing the attack extended far beyond the immediate family members to include the hundreds of resort guests who observed the incident and the first responders who attempted to provide aid. Big Sky Resort arranged for crisis counseling services to be available for guests and employees affected by the tragedy, recognizing that many individuals would require professional support to process the traumatic experience and prevent long-term psychological complications. Security Officer Martinez, who had drawn his weapon but was unable to fire safely due to the risk of injuring bystanders, struggled with feelings of helplessness and guilt regarding his inability to prevent James's death. He subsequently underwent counseling provided by the resort's Employee Assistance Program and eventually decided to leave his position in security work, finding that the trauma of the incident had made it impossible for him to continue in a role that might require him to face similar situations. Dr. Cooper, whose veterinary training had enabled her to recognize the bear's presence earlier than other guests, experienced recurring nightmares and anxiety attacks in the weeks following the incident. Despite her professional knowledge of animal behavior, she found herself questioning whether she could have taken different actions that might have prevented the attack, illustrating the complex psychological responses that can affect even trained professionals who witness traumatic events. The resort's staff members who participated in the emergency response and cleanup efforts also required counseling and support services. Maintenance workers, who were responsible for cleaning blood from the snow and removing other physical evidence of the attack, found the experience particularly traumatic, as their duties required them to confront the graphic reality of violence in a location associated with family recreation and celebration. The financial impact of the bear attack on Big Sky Resort included immediate costs related to emergency response, medical evacuation, investigation support, and crisis management, as well as longer-term expenses associated with enhanced security measures, legal settlements, and lost revenue from cancelled reservations. Resort management estimated that the total cost of the incident would exceed $10 million when all direct and indirect expenses were calculated. Insurance claims related to the attack included not only the resort's liability coverage, but also policies held by individual guests who experienced psychological trauma or cancelled future reservations due to safety concerns. The complexity of determining appropriate compensation for various types of damages created a lengthy claims process that continued for more than 2 years after the incident occurred. The Whitaker family's lawsuit against Big Sky Resort, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and several other defendants was filed in federal court in Montana in March 2026, seeking damages for wrongful death, pain and suffering, lost future earnings, and psychological trauma experienced by Sarah, Emma, and Lucas. The case was ultimately settled out of court for an undisclosed amount that was reported by legal observers to be in the range of $15 to $20 million. Changes to wildlife management protocols implemented in response to the bear attack included enhanced monitoring of bear activity near recreational areas, improved communication systems between wildlife agencies and resort operators, and mandatory training programs for security personnel regarding appropriate responses to wildlife encounters. These changes were intended to prevent similar tragedies from occurring at other recreational facilities throughout the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Big Sky Resort implemented comprehensive revisions to its safety protocols, including the installation of bear detection systems using motion sensors and cameras, enhanced lighting throughout the property perimeter, and mandatory wildlife safety training for all employees. The resort also established a partnership with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks to provide regular monitoring of bear activity and immediate notification of potential threats to guest safety. The New Year's Eve celebration was cancelled for 2026 and 2027, as resort management determined that large-scale outdoor events created unacceptable risks for wildlife encounters. When the celebration was eventually resumed in 2028, it featured significantly enhanced security measures, including the presence of wildlife specialists and the use of non-lethal deterrent systems designed to prevent bears and other large predators from approaching the event area. Sarah Whitaker's decision to return to work as a pediatric nurse 6 months after James's death was motivated by her need to provide financial stability for Emma and Lucas, as well as her belief that helping other families cope with medical crises would provide meaning and purpose following her devastating loss. However, she found that her experience with trauma had changed her perspective on her professional responsibilities and her ability to provide emotional support to families facing life-threatening situations. Emma Whitaker's academic performance declined significantly in the months following her father's death, as she struggled with concentration problems, sleep difficulties, and recurring intrusive memories of the bear attack. Her school counselors recommended specialized therapy for trauma-related issues, and she eventually participated in a support group for children who had witnessed violence, finding comfort in connecting with other young people who had experienced similar losses. Lucas Whitaker's response to his father's death included behavioral problems at school, difficulties maintaining friendships, and regressive behaviors such as bedwetting and separation anxiety when away from his mother. His treatment included play therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and medication to address anxiety and depression symptoms that interfered with his daily functioning and academic progress. The long-term psychological impact on the Whitaker family included ongoing therapy, lifestyle modifications to avoid situations that triggered traumatic memories, and continued financial support for mental health treatment through the legal settlement. Sarah acknowledged in later interviews that the family would never fully recover from the loss of James and the traumatic circumstances of his death, but that they had learned to build meaningful lives while honoring his memory. The broader impact of the Big Sky Bear attack extended beyond the immediate victims to influence wildlife management policies, recreational industry safety standards, and public awareness of the risks associated with outdoor recreation in areas inhabited by large predators. The incident became a case study used in professional training programs for park rangers, resort security personnel, and emergency responders throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Educational programs developed in response to the attack emphasize the importance of proper food storage, waste management, and awareness of wildlife behavior patterns for individuals participating in outdoor recreation activities. These programs were implemented at schools, recreation centers, and tourist destinations throughout Montana and other states with significant bear populations, reaching thousands of people who might otherwise remain unaware of appropriate safety precautions. The scientific study of Bear 274's behavior and the circumstances leading to the attack contributed to research on human-wildlife conflict and the factors that influence bear behavior in developed areas. Dr. Thompson's analysis of the incident was published in the Journal of Wildlife Management and became one of the most cited papers on bear-human interactions, influencing wildlife management practices throughout North America. Memorial services for James Whitaker were held in Denver, Colorado on January 8, 2026, attended by over 400 family members, friends, and colleagues who gathered to celebrate his life and support Sarah, Emma, and Lucas during their time of grief. The service featured tributes to James's dedication to his family, his professional achievements, and his ultimate sacrifice in attempting to protect his loved ones from the attacking bear. A scholarship fund established in James's memory provided financial assistance to children who had lost parents in wildlife-related accidents, supporting their educational goals while honoring the memory of a father who had prioritized his children's welfare above his own safety. The fund raised over $200,000 in its first year, demonstrating the widespread impact of James's story on people who never knew him personally, but were moved by the circumstances of his death. The anniversary of the bear attack became an annual occasion for renewed media attention and public discussion of wildlife safety issues, with news organizations regularly featuring updates on the Whitaker family's recovery and changes in wildlife management practices implemented since the incident. These anniversary reports serve to maintain public awareness of the ongoing risks associated with human activities in wildlife habitat, while honoring the memory of James Whitaker and the circumstances that led to his death. 5 years after the attack, Sarah Whitaker published a memoir titled After the Bear, A Family's Journey Through Tragedy and Recovery, which became a bestseller and provided detailed insights into the long-term impacts of witnessing violent death and losing a spouse and parent under traumatic circumstances. The book's proceeds were donated to wildlife conservation organizations and victim support services, continuing James's legacy through charitable contributions that address the issues surrounding his death. Emma Whitaker eventually pursued a career in wildlife biology, motivated by her desire to understand the factors that contributed to her father's death and to work toward preventing similar tragedies. Her research focused on human-wildlife conflict mitigation and the development of early warning systems for detecting potentially dangerous wildlife activity near recreational areas. Her work was directly influenced by her personal experience with the consequences of inadequate wildlife management and represented her way of honoring her father's memory through meaningful professional contributions. Lucas Whitaker chose a different path, becoming a paramedic and emergency medical technician who specialized in trauma response and wilderness rescue operations. His career choice reflected his desire to help people in crisis situations and potentially save lives in circumstances similar to those that had claimed his father. His first-hand experience with the aftermath of violent trauma provided him with unique empathy and understanding that enhanced his effectiveness in providing emergency medical care. The location where James Whitaker died was marked by a small memorial plaque installed by Big Sky Resort in consultation with the Whitaker family, honoring his sacrifice while serving as a reminder of the importance of wildlife safety awareness. The memorial became a site visited by thousands of resort guests each year, many of whom left flowers, notes, or other tributes to a man they had never met, but whose story had touched their lives. The grizzly bear that killed James Whitaker was the subject of extensive scientific study, with its preserved remains providing researchers with valuable data about bear physiology, behavior, and the factors that contribute to aggressive encounters with humans. Tissue samples, skeletal measurements, and other biological specimens contributed to ongoing research projects aimed at improving understanding of bear ecology and developing more effective management strategies. The video footage and photographs captured during the bear attack became controversial exhibits in legal proceedings, scientific research, and educational programs, raising ethical questions about the appropriate use of graphic documentation of violent death. The widespread distribution of these images through social media platforms created ongoing trauma for the Whitaker family and other witnesses, while simultaneously providing valuable evidence for investigators and researchers studying the incident. Policy changes implemented by Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks in response to the Big Sky attack included enhanced funding for bear monitoring programs, improved communication protocols between wildlife agencies and recreational facility operators, and revised regulations governing the storage and disposal of food waste in areas with high bear activity. These changes represented the most significant overhaul of bear management policies in Montana since the establishment of the state's grizzly bear recovery program in the 1970s. The economic impact of increased wildlife safety measures extended beyond the immediate costs of implementation to include ongoing expenses for monitoring, enforcement, and public education programs designed to reduce the risk of future bear-human conflicts. State and federal agencies allocated millions of dollars to these programs, representing a significant investment in preventing tragedies similar to the one that claimed James Whitaker's life. The Big Sky bear attack influenced recreational industry standards throughout North America, with resort operators, campground managers, and other outdoor recreation providers implementing enhanced safety protocols based on lessons learned from the Montana incident. Industry associations developed new guidelines for wildlife risk assessment and emergency response planning that became standard practice for facilities operating in areas with large predator populations. International attention focused on the Big Sky attack included coverage by news organizations in Canada, Europe, and other regions where similar human-wildlife conflicts occur, making James Whitaker's story a global symbol of the challenges associated with balancing recreational development with wildlife conservation. His death became part of the broader discussion about human responsibility for coexistence with large predators and the ethical implications of human activities in wilderness areas. The psychological counseling and support services provided to the Whitaker family and other witnesses to the attack became a model for crisis response programs implemented at other recreational facilities and in communities affected by traumatic incidents involving wildlife. Mental health professionals who worked with the Big Sky victims developed specialized protocols for treating trauma related to animal attacks, contributing to improved understanding of this specific type of psychological injury. Research conducted using data from the Big Sky attack contributed to the development of new technologies for detecting and deterring potentially dangerous wildlife near human activity areas. These innovations included improved motion sensor systems, automated alert networks, and non-lethal deterrent devices designed to prevent bears and other large predators from approaching populated areas without causing them permanent harm. The legacy of James Whitaker's death extended far beyond the immediate tragedy to influence wildlife management practices, recreational industry safety standards, legal precedents for liability in wildlife encounters, and public awareness of the ongoing risks associated with human activities in areas inhabited by large predators. His sacrifice in attempting to protect his family became a symbol of parental devotion, while simultaneously highlighting the need for better preparation and prevention strategies to protect families enjoying outdoor recreation activities. Educational materials developed using the Big Sky case study reached thousands of students, recreation professionals, and outdoor enthusiasts, providing them with detailed information about bear behavior, safety protocols, and appropriate responses to wildlife encounters. These educational programs represented one of the most significant positive outcomes of the tragedy, potentially preventing future attacks through improved public knowledge and awareness. The scientific and policy changes resulting from James Whitaker's death demonstrated how a single tragic incident could catalyze widespread improvements in public safety and wildlife management practices. While his family continued to mourn their devastating loss, the broader impacts of his death contributed to enhanced protection for countless other families participating in outdoor recreation activities throughout North America and beyond, ensuring that his sacrifice would have lasting meaning for future generations of people seeking to enjoy wilderness areas safely. The story of December 31st, 2025, at Big Sky Resort became more than an account of a tragic wildlife encounter. It evolved into a comprehensive examination of the complex relationships between human recreation, wildlife conservation, and public safety, in an era of increasing intersection between human development and natural habitat. James Whitaker's death marked not only the loss of a devoted husband and father, but also a pivotal moment in the ongoing effort to balance human enjoyment of natural areas with respect for the wild animals that call those places home, creating a legacy that would influence wildlife management and outdoor recreation safety for decades to come. The next stories. March 19th, 2024. Kodiak bear mauls 5 loggers in Alaskan forest. The morning fog rolled across Prince William Sound like a grey shroud, obscuring the jagged peaks of Afognak Island as the Sitka spruce logging barge cut through the choppy waters at precisely 5:47 a.m. Foreman Dale Richardson stood on the vessel's bow, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he surveyed the approaching shoreline through binoculars. At 53 years old, Richardson had spent 31 years harvesting timber from Alaska's most remote forests. But something about this particular morning gnawed at him with an unease he couldn't quite articulate. The contract from Kodiak Lumber Consortium called for clear-cutting a 12-acre parcel of old-growth Sitka spruce on the island's southeastern peninsula, a job that should have been routine for his experienced crew of 14 men. Richardson lowered his binoculars and turned to address the loggers gathered behind him on the deck. "Listen up, boys," he called over the rumble of the barge's diesel engines. We're looking at dense timber, steep terrain, and weather reports showing potential storms rolling in by late afternoon. I want everyone sharp today. This isn't some easy coastal cut. We're going deep into bear country." He paused, studying the faces of his crew. "Tommy, you and Martinez get the Cat D8 bulldozer unloaded first. We'll need that access road pushed through before we can move the fella buncher into position." 28-year-old Tommy Eriksson nodded, adjusting his hard hat. A third-generation logger from Ketchikan, Tommy had inherited his grandfather's respect for Alaska's wilderness and his father's methodical approach to dangerous work. Beside him, Carlos Martinez wiped grease from his hands with a rag, the 41-year-old equipment operator already mentally preparing for the complex task of maneuvering heavy machinery through unmarked forest terrain. As the barge approached the makeshift landing site, a narrow strip of rocky beach backed by towering spruce and hemlock, Captain William "Bill" Hendricks guided the vessel's bow onto the shore with practiced precision. Hendricks, a grizzled 57-year-old mariner who had been ferrying logging crews around southeast Alaska for 2 decades, killed the engines and secured the mooring lines. "Tide'll be going out around noon," he announced to Richardson. "If you need me to reposition the barge for loading, give me a holler on Channel 16. The foreman acknowledged with a wave, already focused on coordinating the complex choreography of unloading equipment onto the beach. The crew worked with mechanical efficiency, born of countless similar operations. Crane operator James "Big Jim" Sullivan, a massive 45-year-old who stood 6'4" and weighed nearly 300 pounds, guided the barge's hydraulic crane as it lifted the D8 bulldozer from the deck. Sullivan had earned his nickname not just from his imposing physical presence, but from his ability to maneuver even the largest equipment with surgical precision. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air as he concentrated on setting the 37-ton machine safely onto the rocky shore. "Easy does it," called Martinez from the beach, guiding the descent with hand signals. The bulldozer's tracks made contact with solid ground at 6:23 a.m., followed by the fella buncher, 2 pickup trucks loaded with chainsaws and fuel, and various support equipment. While the unloading continued, Richardson consulted his GPS unit and paper maps, confirming their position at coordinates 58.0847 degrees north, 152.7014 degrees west. The logging site lay approximately 2.3 miles inland through dense forest, following what had once been a World War II military access road but had long since been reclaimed by vegetation. The elevation would climb from sea level to nearly 800 feet, requiring the bulldozer to cut a new access route through terrain that hadn't seen industrial activity in over 70 years. Richardson's crew consisted of men with a combined experience of more than 400 years in Alaska's logging industry, yet even he felt a familiar tension as they prepared to venture into one of the most remote and potentially dangerous work sites of his career. Michael "Spike" Harrison, the crew's youngest member at 24, finished securing the last of the chainsaws in a pickup truck bed. Harrison had earned his nickname during his first season when a falling branch had impaled his hard hat, missing his skull by inches. The close call had only strengthened his resolve to master the dangerous art of professional logging. Originally from Oregon, he'd come to Alaska seeking adventure and the high wages that came with hazardous work in remote locations. His enthusiasm sometimes concerned the veteran loggers, but Richardson appreciated the young man's willingness to tackle any task without complaint. By 7:15 a.m., the crew had formed a convoy with Martinez operating the bulldozer in the lead, followed by Sullivan driving the fella buncher and the 2 pickup trucks bringing up the rear. Richardson rode in the passenger seat of the lead truck, driven by his assistant foreman, Robert "Bobby" Crenshaw, a steady 36-year-old who had worked under Richardson for 8 years. Crenshaw's methodical nature and attention to safety protocols made him Richardson's most trusted deputy, particularly in situations where split-second decisions could mean the difference between injury and catastrophe. The convoy began its slow progress inland, following the remnants of the old military road. Martinez pushed the bulldozer at a cautious pace, its blade clearing fallen logs, dense undergrowth and occasional boulders that had rolled down from the steep hillsides. The Sitka spruce towered above them, some specimens reaching heights of over 200 feet and diameters exceeding 8 feet. These ancient giants had witnessed centuries of Alaskan history, from Russian fur traders to American military installations, and now faced the modern reality of commercial timber harvesting. As they climbed higher into the forest, the character of the woodland changed dramatically. The understory became increasingly dense, with devil's club, salmonberry bushes, and thick carpets of moss creating an almost impenetrable green maze. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet in any direction, and the sounds of the heavy machinery seemed muffled by the overwhelming presence of living vegetation. Richardson checked his radio periodically, maintaining contact with Captain Hendricks at the beach and monitoring weather updates from the National Weather Service station in Kodiak. At 8:42 a.m., Martinez brought the bulldozer to a halt as they encountered a particularly challenging section of terrain. A small creek, swollen with spring runoff, had carved a deep ravine across their intended path. Richardson dismounted from the pickup to survey the obstacle, joined by Crenshaw, Martinez, and several other crew members. "We'll need to build up the approaches and reinforce the bottom," Richardson declared after studying the ravine's dimensions. "Bobby, get the guys started on gathering rocks for the base. Carlos, think you can angle your blade to create a gradual descent." The work proceeded methodically, with crew members hand-selecting stones from the surrounding area to create a stable foundation for the creek crossing. Martinez demonstrated his considerable skill by manipulating the bulldozer's blade to precisely grade the approaches, creating slopes gentle enough for the Feller-Buncher to navigate safely. The process consumed nearly 2 hours, but Richardson insisted on taking the time necessary to ensure safe passage for all equipment. During this work, several crew members reported seeing fresh bear sign in the immediate area. Paul Grizzly Adams, a 43-year-old choker setter whose nickname ironically reflected his paranoid fear of bear encounters, discovered a series of massive paw prints in the soft earth near the creek bank. Adams, despite his nickname and phobia, was one of the crew's most experienced loggers, having worked in bear country for 15 years without incident. "These tracks are huge, Dale," he called to Richardson, his voice tight with concern. "Bigger than anything I've seen before, and they're fresh, maybe from last night or early this morning." Richardson examined the tracks, using his hand as a measuring device. The front paw prints measured nearly 14 inches in length and 8 inches in width, with claw marks extending an additional 4 inches beyond the toe pads. Based on his experience in bear country, Richardson estimated they were dealing with an adult male Kodiak bear weighing somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 pounds. "Spread the word," he instructed Crenshaw. "Everyone stays alert and nobody wanders off alone. We'll post a couple of guys as lookouts while we're cutting." The discovery of bear sign added a new dimension of tension to an already challenging operation. Kodiak bears, the largest subspecies of brown bear in North America, were known for their territorial behavior and unpredictable nature, particularly during the spring months when they emerged from winter dens, hungry and aggressive. Richardson had encountered bears on numerous occasions throughout his career, but the size of these tracks suggested they were dealing with an exceptionally large and potentially dangerous individual. By 11:20 a.m., the convoy had successfully crossed the ravine and resumed its progress toward the logging site. The access road climbed steadily through increasingly challenging terrain, requiring Martinez to navigate around massive boulders, steep drop-offs, and dense thickets of alder and willow. The forest seemed to close in around them with each passing mile, creating an almost claustrophobic atmosphere that several crew members found unsettling. Veterans like Danny "Sawdust" Miller, a 50-year-old sawyer from Juneau, noted how the usual sounds of Alaskan wildlife, bird calls, squirrel chatter, the rustle of small mammals in the underbrush, seemed conspicuously absent from this particular stretch of forest. Miller had earned his nickname through 26 years of chainsaw work that left him perpetually coated in wood chips and sawdust. His expertise with a chainsaw was legendary among Alaska's logging community, and his ability to read forest conditions had prevented numerous accidents over the years. "Something's not right about this place," he confided to his partner Eugene "Gene" Walsh, a 39-year-old faller who had recently transferred to Alaska from timber operations in Washington state. Walsh, still adjusting to the unique challenges of Alaskan logging, trusted Miller's instincts implicitly and made mental notes to stay particularly alert throughout the day's operations. At 12:05 p.m., the convoy finally reached the designated logging site, a natural clearing on a southeast-facing slope approximately 2.7 miles from the beach. The area had been selected by Kodiak Lumber Consortium's forestry consultants based on aerial surveys and timber quality assessments, but none of the advanced reconnaissance had included ground-level evaluation of wildlife activity or terrain challenges. Richardson dismounted and began surveying the site with a critical eye, noting the dense concentration of mature Sitka spruce and the challenging topography that would complicate felling operations. The logging site occupied roughly 12 acres of steep terrain, with elevation changes of up to 200 feet from the lowest to highest points. The mature spruce trees averaged between 150 and 180 feet in height, with several exceptional specimens exceeding 200 feet. Based on diameter measurements, Richardson estimated the site contained approximately 850,000 board feet of high-quality timber, making it one of the most valuable single-day cuts of his career. However, the steep slopes and dense understory would require careful planning to ensure both worker safety and efficient timber extraction. Richardson gathered his crew for a comprehensive safety briefing, spreading a hand-drawn site map on the hood of one of the pickup trucks. "Here's how we're going to work this," he began, tracing the planned felling pattern with his finger. "We'll start on the upper slopes and work our way down, using the natural gradient to assist with log movement. Danny and Gene will handle the primary felling, with Tommy and Spike working cleanup and delimbing. Carlos, you'll position the feller buncher here," he pointed to a relatively flat area in the center of the site, "and create collection points for the logs. Jim, you'll run the loader to move processed timber to the loading area we'll establish near the access road." The safety briefing continued for 23 minutes, covering escape routes, communication protocols, and emergency procedures specific to the challenging terrain. Richardson emphasized the importance of maintaining visual and radio contact at all times, particularly given the fresh bear sign they had encountered during the approach. Each crew member was assigned a specific radio channel and reminded to check in every 15 minutes during active operations. Richardson also designated Crenshaw and Adams as roving safety observers, responsible for monitoring overall site conditions and watching for wildlife activity. As the crew prepared their equipment for the afternoon's work, the weather began to change noticeably. The morning's fog had dissipated, but heavy clouds were building to the west, and the wind had shifted to come from the southwest, typically a precursor to significant weather systems moving in from the Gulf of Alaska. Richardson checked his barometric pressure gauge and noted a steady decline that suggested a major storm system was approaching, possibly arriving earlier than the original forecast had predicted. At 1:47 p.m., the first trees began falling under the skilled hands of Miller and Walsh. The distinctive roar of chainsaws cutting through massive Sitka spruce echoed across the mountainside, punctuated by the thunderous crash of 200-foot giants hitting the forest floor. Each tree required careful calculation of fall direction, considering not only the natural lean of the trunk, but also wind conditions, surrounding obstacles, and the safety of crew members working in the area. Miller's experience showed in his precise notching technique, creating guide cuts that ensured each tree fell exactly where intended, despite the challenging terrain. Martinez maneuvered the bulldozer into position to begin creating skid roads, cleared paths that would allow the feller buncher to access felled trees and transport them to central collection points. The work was physically demanding and required constant communication between equipment operators and ground crew members. Sullivan operated the feller buncher with remarkable skill, using its articulated boom and grapple to lift logs weighing several tons and position them precisely for further processing. The machine's hydraulic system strained under the immense weight of the old-growth timber, creating a symphony of mechanical sounds that masked the more subtle noises of the surrounding forest. Tommy Erickson and Spike Harrison worked as a team, following behind the primary felling operations to remove branches and cut the massive logs into manageable sections. Their chainsaws generated clouds of sawdust that mixed with the afternoon air, creating a distinctive aroma of fresh-cut wood and two-stroke engine exhaust. Both men wore full safety gear, including hard hats, face shields, cut-resistant chaps, and steel-toed boots. But the physical demands of the work left them sweating profusely, despite the cool mountain air. By 3:20 p.m., the crew had successfully felled and processed nearly 30 trees, establishing a productive rhythm that Richardson estimated would allow them to complete the contract within the allocated time frame. The first load of processed logs had been transported to the staging area near the access road, where they would eventually be loaded onto logging trucks for transport back to the barge. Despite the earlier concerns about bear activity, the afternoon had proceeded without incident, and crew morale was high as they made visible progress toward completing the challenging job. However, the weather situation continued to deteriorate. Wind speeds had increased to over 25 miles per hour, causing the tops of the remaining standing trees to sway ominously. Richardson made the decision to halt felling operations until the wind subsided, as falling trees could become unpredictable projectiles in high wind conditions. The crew used the forced break to perform equipment maintenance, fuel chainsaws, and prepare for an intensive push once weather conditions improved. During this lull in operations, several crew members reported hearing unusual sounds from the forest surrounding the logging site. Adams, whose acute sensitivity to potential bear encounters had saved him from dangerous situations in the past, insisted he had heard what sounded like heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush approximately 200 yards uphill from their position. "It's probably nothing," he admitted to Richardson, "but something big is moving around up there, and it's not spooked by our noise like most wildlife would be." Richardson took Adams' concerns seriously, knowing that the man's paranoid attention to bear behavior had proven accurate on previous occasions. He assigned Walsh and Miller to conduct a brief reconnaissance of the area above the logging site, instructing them to work in pairs and maintain constant radio contact. The two experienced loggers moved carefully through the dense understory, following game trails and natural clearings as they searched for signs of wildlife activity. At 4:03 p.m., Walsh's voice crackled over the radio with barely controlled excitement. "Dale, you need to hear this. We found a daybed about 300 yards uphill from the site. Fresh scat, hair samples on the trees, and the vegetation is completely flattened in a circle about 12 feet across. Whatever made this bed is massive, and it's been watching us work." The discovery sent a chill through the entire crew. Daybeds were temporary resting places used by bears to observe their territory while remaining concealed from potential threats or prey. The fact that a large bear had been observing their operation from a concealed position fundamentally changed the risk assessment for the remainder of the job. Richardson immediately implemented enhanced security protocols, posting two-man teams as dedicated lookouts positioned to cover all approaches to the logging site. Crenshaw and Adams took the first watch, positioning themselves with clear lines of sight toward the area where the daybed had been discovered. All crew members were instructed to work in pairs and maintain constant awareness of their surroundings, with particular attention to escape routes and emergency procedures. Richardson also established a direct radio link with Captain Hendricks, ensuring that emergency evacuation could be initiated immediately if the situation deteriorated. The wind began to subside around 4:30 p.m., allowing the crew to resume felling operations with heightened caution. Miller and Walsh returned to their chainsaw work, but their previous casual efficiency was replaced by constant vigilance and frequent pauses to scan the surrounding forest. The psychological impact of knowing they were being observed by a large predator was evident in the crew's body language and communication patterns. Conversations became more clipped and focused on immediate tasks, while the usual banter and jokes that characterized logging crew dynamics virtually disappeared. Sullivan continued operating the feller buncher, but found himself repeatedly checking the mirrors and windows of his enclosed cab for signs of movement in the forest. The machine's hydraulic system seemed louder than usual in the tense atmosphere, and he found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on the precise movements required for safe log handling. Martinez experienced similar difficulties with the bulldozer, frequently stopping his work to scan the tree line for any indication of the bear's location. At 5:17 p.m., the situation escalated dramatically. Erickson, who had been de-limbing a massive spruce log near the eastern edge of the clearing, suddenly froze and raised his hand in the universal signal for silence. "Movement in the trees," he whispered into his radio microphone. "Something big, maybe 50 yards out, moving parallel to our position." Every member of the crew stopped what they were doing and turned toward Erickson's location, straining to see through the dense vegetation that surrounded the logging site. Richardson grabbed his binoculars and moved carefully toward Erickson's position, followed by Crenshaw and several other crew members. Through the dense undergrowth, they could make out the vague shape of something large moving slowly through the forest, pausing occasionally as if studying the human activity in the clearing. The bear, for there was no doubt about what they were observing, appeared to be conducting a deliberate reconnaissance of the logging operation, moving in a systematic pattern that suggested intelligence and careful planning rather than random wandering. "Jesus Christ," breathed Harrison, who had never encountered a bear during his brief logging career. "How big do you think it is?" The question hung in the air as the crew watched the massive animal continue its methodical survey of their position. Based on the portions visible through the vegetation and the way it moved through dense undergrowth that would stop most other animals, Richardson estimated they were dealing with a Kodiak bear weighing well over 1,000 pounds, possibly approaching the 1,200-pound range that represented the upper end of the size spectrum for the species. The bear's behavior was particularly troubling to the experienced crew members. Rather than fleeing from human activity as bears typically did, this animal seemed curious about the logging operation and unafraid of the noise and mechanical activity. Such behavior could indicate several possibilities. The bear might be defending a food source or den site in the immediate area. It could be a dominant male asserting territorial claims, or it might simply be an unusually bold individual that had lost its natural fear of humans through previous encounters. For nearly 10 minutes, the crew watched as the bear continued its reconnaissance, occasionally rising on its hind legs to get a better view of the clearing. When standing upright, The animal's head was clearly visible above the surrounding vegetation, confirming Richardson's estimate of its exceptional size. The bear's coat appeared to be the typical brown coloration of Kodiak subspecies, but with distinctive darker patches around the shoulders and back that suggested it was a mature male in prime condition. At 5:28 p.m., the bear abruptly changed its behavior pattern. Instead of continuing its careful observation from a distance, it began moving directly toward the logging site, following a route that would bring it to the western edge of the clearing where Erickson and Harrison had been working on log processing. The change from reconnaissance to approach triggered immediate alarm among the crew members, who recognized that they were transitioning from a manageable wildlife encounter to a potentially dangerous confrontation. "Everyone to the vehicles now," Richardson commanded over the radio. "Move slowly, don't run, and keep your eyes on the tree line." The crew began a controlled withdrawal toward the two pickup trucks and heavy equipment, maintaining the discipline that years of dangerous work had ingrained in them. However, the bear's approach accelerated as it detected the human movement, and within seconds it emerged from the tree line at the western edge of the clearing. The first full view of the animal confirmed everyone's worst fears about its size and potential threat level. The Kodiak bear stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, while on all fours, with a massive head that appeared disproportionately large, even for its enormous body. Its coat was thick and glossy, indicating excellent health and nutrition, while its movements displayed the fluid power that made brown bears among the most formidable predators in North America. Most alarming was the bear's demeanor. Rather than showing the typical wariness or fear that characterized most bear-human encounters, this animal displayed what could only be described as aggressive confidence. Richardson reached the lead pickup truck and immediately grabbed the shotgun he kept mounted in the cab's rear window. The weapon was loaded with alternating rounds of rubber bullets and steel slugs, designed to provide options for deterring wildlife without necessarily killing valuable game animals. However, as he chambered the first round and flicked off the safety, Richardson realized that deterrence might not be possible given the bear's size and apparent aggression level. "Dale, it's still coming," called Crenshaw from his position near the second pickup truck. The bear had moved approximately 50 yards into the clearing and showed no signs of stopping or being deterred by the human activity. Its pace was deliberate but purposeful, covering ground with the deceptively swift gait that allowed brown bears to reach speeds of 35 miles per hour, despite their massive size. The crew members who had reached the vehicles found themselves trapped in an increasingly dangerous situation, as the bear's route of approach would cut off their primary escape route via the access road. Miller and Walsh, who had been working on the far side of the clearing when the encounter began, found themselves separated from the vehicles by the bear's approach route. Both men carried chainsaws, but had shut them down when the alert was given, leaving them with only hand tools and their experience for protection. They began moving toward the Feller Buncher, where Sullivan's enclosed cab might provide temporary shelter, but the bear's movement pattern suggested it was aware of their position and might intercept them before they could reach safety. At 5:31 p.m., the situation deteriorated beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. The bear, now only 30 yards from the nearest crew members, suddenly accelerated from a walk to a charge, covering the remaining distance with terrifying speed. Richardson fired the first rubber bullet, aiming for the animal's chest in hopes of delivering enough impact to turn the charge. The projectile struck the bear's center mass, but had no visible effect on its momentum or determination. The animal's massive size and thick hide absorbed the impact without producing the painful deterrent effect that typically caused bears to retreat. "It's not stopping!" Richardson shouted as he chambered a steel slug. The bear was now within 15 yards of Erickson and Harrison, who had been caught in the open while attempting to reach the pickup trucks. Both young men dove behind a partially processed log, but the cover was inadequate against an animal capable of moving objects weighing several tons. Harrison's terrified scream echoed across the clearing as the bear closed the final distance and reached the log where they had taken shelter. The attack began with devastating suddenness. The 1,100-pound Kodiak bear struck the log with sufficient force to roll it several feet, exposing Harrison, who had been crouched behind it. The animal's massive paw caught the young logger across the chest and shoulder, sending him tumbling across the clearing like a discarded toy. The bear's claws, each measuring over 4 inches in length, opened 4 parallel gashes in Harrison's chest that immediately began spurting arterial blood. His screams of pain and terror galvanized the rest of the crew into desperate action. Richardson fired the steel slug at point-blank range, striking the bear in the shoulder. The heavy projectile penetrated several inches into the animal's massive frame, but failed to reach any vital organs due to the bear's extraordinary size and the thick layers of muscle and fat that protected its torso. Instead of deterring the attack, the wound seemed to enrage the bear further, causing it to wheel around and focus its attention on Richardson as the source of the painful stimulus. Erickson, who had managed to avoid the initial charge, found himself directly in the bear's path as it turned toward Richardson. The animal's massive head swung toward him with lightning speed, and before he could react, powerful jaws closed around his left leg, just above the knee. The bear's bite force, estimated at over 1,200 pounds per square inch, crushed through his heavy work pants and deep into the flesh and bone of his thigh. Erickson's agonized scream joined Harrison's in creating a horrific soundtrack to the unfolding disaster. The bear shook Erickson like a dog, worrying a toy, his body whipping back and forth as the animal's neck muscles applied tremendous force to his trapped leg. The violent shaking motion caused massive internal injuries, as bones fractured and soft tissue tore under the tremendous pressure. Blood sprayed in wide arcs across the clearing as major blood vessels were severed by the bear's teeth and claws, creating a growing pool of crimson that soaked into the sawdust and wood chips scattered across the work area. Crenshaw had reached the second pickup truck and was frantically attempting to start the engine, planning to use the vehicle as a weapon against the attacking bear. However, in his panic, he flooded the engine and the truck refused to turn over, despite his repeated attempts. "Come on, come on!" he screamed at the unresponsive vehicle while watching his colleagues being mauled less than 50 feet away. The truck's starter motor ground repeatedly, but failed to catch, leaving Crenshaw helpless to intervene in the attack. Martinez had been operating the bulldozer when the attack began and now found himself in the unique position of controlling the most powerful piece of equipment on the logging site. He immediately began maneuvering the 37-ton machine toward the attack site, dropping the blade and advancing at full throttle. The D8's diesel engine roared as Martinez pushed it beyond its normal operating parameters, hoping to reach the bear before it could inflict fatal injuries on his trapped colleagues. The bear released its grip on Erickson's leg and turned to face this new threat, rising to its full height on hind legs as the bulldozer approached. Standing upright, the animal reached nearly 9 feet in height, its massive arms spread wide in a threat display that revealed the incredible breadth of its chest and shoulders. For a moment, bear and machine faced each other in a surreal tableau that seemed to pit raw, natural power against human technology and determination. Martinez didn't hesitate. He rammed the bulldozer's blade directly into the standing bear, applying full engine power as he attempted to push the animal away from the injured loggers. The impact knocked the bear backward, but also demonstrated its incredible strength and resilience. Rather than being crushed or seriously injured by the collision, the bear grabbed the bulldozer's blade with both front paws and began pulling itself up onto the machine, its claws screeching against the steel surface as it sought to reach Martinez in the operator's cab. The sight of an 1,100-pound bear climbing onto heavy construction equipment defied everything the crew knew about wildlife behavior. Bears were supposed to retreat from large, noisy machines, not attack them directly. However, this individual seemed determined to destroy whatever was interfering with its assault on the human intruders. Its massive claws left deep gouges in the bulldozer's steel surfaces as it climbed higher, seeking a way to reach the operator who had dared to challenge its dominance. Martinez frantically manipulated the bulldozer's controls, raising and lowering the blade in an attempt to dislodge his unwanted passenger. The bear's weight caused the machine to handle erratically, and Martinez struggled to maintain control while the animal continued its climbing assault. Hydraulic fluid began spraying from damaged lines as the bear's claws punctured hoses and fittings, reducing the bulldozer's functionality and creating additional hazards for everyone in the immediate area. Meanwhile, Richardson had reloaded his shotgun and was attempting to line up another shot at the bear, but Martinez's efforts to dislodge the animal made it impossible to fire without risking hitting the bulldozer operator. The bear and machine were locked in a violent dance that sent clouds of diesel exhaust and hydraulic fluid mist across the clearing, reducing visibility and making precise targeting virtually impossible. Sullivan, operating the Feller-Buncher from his enclosed cab approximately 100 yards away, made the split-second decision to abandon his relatively safe position and attempt a rescue. He began maneuvering the massive logging machine toward the attack site, extending its articulated boom and grapple in hopes of grabbing the bear and pulling it away from the bulldozer. The Feller-Buncher's tracks left deep impressions in the forest floor as Sullivan pushed the machine beyond its normal operating limits, racing against time to prevent additional casualties. Harrison, despite his severe chest wounds, managed to crawl toward one of the pickup trucks, leaving a trail of blood that marked his agonizing progress across the clearing. His breathing was labored and shallow, indicating that the bear's claws had likely punctured at least one lung, but survival instinct drove him to seek shelter and distance from the ongoing battle. Each movement sent waves of excruciating pain through his lacerated chest, but the alternative, remaining motionless in the open, meant certain death if the bear broke free from its engagement with the heavy equipment. Erickson lay where the bear had dropped him, his left leg twisted at an unnatural angle and spurting blood from multiple puncture wounds. The femur had been completely fractured by the bear's bite, and several major blood vessels had been severed, creating a life-threatening hemorrhage situation. Consciousness flickered in and out as shock began to overwhelm his system, but he maintained enough awareness to realize that his survival depended on the outcome of the mechanical battle taking place nearby. The bear succeeded in reaching the bulldozer's operator platform and began attacking the protective cage that surrounded Martinez's seat. Its claws and teeth worked frantically at the steel framework, producing showers of sparks and the screech of metal being torn and twisted. Martinez crouched as low as possible within the confines of his seat, using his hard hat and heavy jacket as protection against the debris raining down from the bear's assault. The operator's cage, designed to protect against rolling equipment and falling objects, was never intended to withstand attack by a massive predator. At 5:37 p.m., Sullivan's Feller-Buncher reached the embattled bulldozer, and he immediately deployed the machine's grapple in an attempt to seize the bear. The hydraulic-powered claws closed around the animal's midsection, applying tremendous pressure as Sullivan attempted to lift it away from Martinez. However, the bear's incredible strength allowed it to resist the grapple's grip, and it began attacking the Feller-Buncher's boom with the same fury it had directed at the bulldozer. The battle between bear and machinery reached a crescendo of violence and mechanical noise that could be heard for miles across the wilderness. Both pieces of heavy equipment strained beyond their designed limits as hydraulic systems failed and diesel engines overheated from extreme operating conditions. The bear, seemingly oblivious to pain or physical damage, continued its assault on both machines simultaneously, its massive strength allowing it to fight on multiple fronts. Richardson finally found a clear shot and fired another steel slug at the bear's head and neck area, hoping to strike the spinal column or brainstem. The projectile struck the animal behind the left ear, penetrating deeply into the skull and causing immediate neurological damage. The bear's assault on the machinery ceased abruptly as it lost coordination and balance, tumbling from the bulldozer onto the forest floor with a tremendous crash that shook the ground. However, the wound, while serious, was not immediately fatal. The bear thrashed violently on the ground, its massive limbs striking out randomly as damaged neural pathways misfired. Its roars of pain and rage echoed across the mountainside, a primal sound that spoke to millions of years of evolutionary dominance and territorial aggression. Richardson chambered another round and moved closer, hoping to deliver a finishing shot that would end the animal's suffering and eliminate the ongoing threat. Before Richardson could fire again, the bear's random thrashing brought it into contact with Miller and Walsh, who had been attempting to reach the safety of the pickup trucks. Walsh was struck by the animal's massive paw and sent sprawling across the clearing, his ribs fractured by the impact and his breathing severely compromised. Miller tried to help his fallen partner, but found himself directly in the path of the bear's continued death throes. The dying bear's jaws snapped shut on Miller's right arm just below the elbow, the bone-crushing bite severing the radius and ulna, while its teeth penetrated completely through the limb. Miller's screams joined the cacophony of human suffering that now dominated the clearing as the bear's final reflexive actions claimed additional victims. Despite its severe head wound, the animal's jaws remained locked in a death grip that would require mechanical intervention to release. Adams and several other crew members rushed forward with pry bars and chainsaws, desperately attempting to free Miller from the bear's jaws before blood loss became fatal. The chainsaw's blades sparked against the bear's teeth as they cut through the massive skull, but the animal's jaw muscles remained contracted in a rigor-like grip that defied their rescue efforts. Precious minutes ticked by as Miller's life ebbed away through the massive wounds in his arm. At 5:44 p.m., the bear finally succumbed to its injuries, its massive body going limp as brain death ended its reign of terror. However, the damage was already catastrophic. 5 crew members had sustained serious injuries requiring immediate medical evacuation, while both the bulldozer and Fellabuncher had suffered significant mechanical damage that rendered them inoperable. The clearing looked like a battlefield, with blood, hydraulic fluid, and diesel fuel mixing in the sawdust to create a horrific tableau of destruction. Richardson immediately initiated emergency protocols, using his satellite phone to contact the Coast Guard Rescue Coordination Center in Juneau, while Crenshaw attempted to establish radio contact with Captain Hendricks at the beach landing site. The nearest medical facility capable of handling trauma cases was the Providence Medical Center in Kodiak, requiring helicopter evacuation across nearly 60 miles of wilderness and open water. Weather conditions, which had been deteriorating throughout the afternoon, would complicate any rescue attempt significantly. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is logging operation of Fognak 7 requesting immediate medical evacuation. Richardson spoke into the satellite phone with forced calm. We have 5 casualties from a bear attack, multiple severe injuries requiring immediate trauma surgery. Our position is 58 degrees, 5 minutes, 6 seconds north, 152 degrees, 42 minutes, 8 seconds west. Elevation approximately 800 feet. He continued providing detailed information about the injuries and landing zone requirements while other crew members worked frantically to stabilize the wounded. Crenshaw had successfully reached Captain Hendricks, who immediately began preparation for emergency departure to the nearest port with medical facilities. However, the captain's assessment of weather conditions was grim. Wind speeds had increased to over 40 miles per hour, with gusts reaching 60. While visibility had dropped to less than half a mile due to heavy rain and fog, the combination of factors would make helicopter operations extremely dangerous, if not impossible. The crew's first aid supplies, designed to handle typical logging injuries like cuts and minor crush wounds, were woefully inadequate for the massive trauma inflicted by the bear attack. Harrison's chest wounds continued bleeding heavily despite pressure bandages, while Ericsson's shattered leg required immediate surgical intervention to prevent permanent disability or amputation. Miller's severed arm had been partially reattached by the bear's teeth, creating a complex wound that needed microsurgery to save the limb. Walsh's fractured ribs had punctured his left lung, causing a pneumothorax that made breathing increasingly difficult. Without immediate medical intervention, the collapsed lung would prove fatal within hours. Martinez, who had escaped physical injury during his battle with the bear atop the bulldozer, worked alongside Richardson to provide whatever medical assistance their limited training allowed, but both men knew they were fighting a losing battle against time and the severity of the injuries. At 6:12 p.m., the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors announced the arrival of Coast Guard Rescue 6031, an HH-65 Dolphin helicopter based at Air Station Kodiak. The pilot, Commander Sarah Mitchell, had launched immediately upon receiving the distress call, despite weather conditions that were rapidly approaching the limits of safe flight operations. Her crew included co-pilot Lieutenant James Park, Flight Mechanic Petty Officer First Class Derek Thompson, and Rescue Swimmer Petty Officer Second Class Maria Rodriguez. Mitchell circled the logging site multiple times, assessing the landing zone and wind conditions while her crew prepared for what would clearly be a complex medical evacuation. The clearing provided adequate space for landing, but the surrounding tall trees created dangerous downdrafts and wind shear that would challenge even an experienced pilot. Logging site, Coast Guard 6031, Mitchell's voice crackled over Richardson's radio. We have visual on your location and 5 casualties. Be advised, weather conditions are marginal and deteriorating rapidly. We'll have one shot at this extraction. The helicopter's landing created a tremendous downdraft that scattered sawdust and debris across the clearing, reducing visibility to near zero for several seconds. Rodriguez and Thompson immediately deployed from the aircraft with medical equipment and began triage assessment of the 5 injured loggers. Their professional evaluation confirmed Richardson's worst fears. All 5 casualties required immediate trauma surgery, and at least 2 were in danger of dying from blood loss before they could reach medical facilities. We're going to have to make 2 trips, Rodriguez informed Mitchell over the intercom. I can stabilize 3 for transport, but the other 2 need more intensive intervention before they can survive the flight. Though the decision to leave casualties behind went against every instinct of the rescue crew, but the helicopter's weight limitations and the severity of the injuries made it the only viable option. Harrison, Ericsson, and Miller were selected for the first evacuation based on the immediate threat to life posed by their injuries. Rodriguez and Thompson worked with practiced efficiency to stabilize the men for transport, establishing IV lines, administering pain medication, and securing the casualties to transport stretchers. The process consumed precious minutes, while weather conditions continued to deteriorate around them. At 6:38 p.m., the first helicopter departed for Providence Medical Center with its cargo of critically injured loggers. The flight across Prince William Sound would take approximately 25 minutes under normal conditions, but headwinds and turbulence extended the journey to nearly 40 minutes of challenging flight operations. Mitchell pushed her aircraft to its performance limits, while her crew fought to keep the casualties stable during the rough ride. Walsh and Martinez, left behind with the remaining crew members, faced an uncertain wait for the helicopter's return. Weather forecasters were predicting that the approaching storm system would make helicopter operations impossible within the next 2 hours, potentially stranding them on the mountainside overnight with critically injured men. Richardson made the difficult decision to begin moving the remaining casualties toward the beach landing site, hoping to reduce the helicopter's turnaround time when it returned for the second evacuation. The improvised evacuation along the access road became an epic of endurance and determination as the uninjured crew members carried their wounded colleagues through increasingly challenging terrain. Walsh's punctured lung made every step an agony of breathlessness, while Martinez's injuries from his battle with the bear became apparent as adrenaline wore off and shock began to set in. The journey that had taken the convoy 3 hours with heavy equipment stretched into a nightmare trek through darkness and worsening weather. Captain Hendricks had moved the barge as close to shore as possible and prepared the vessel's limited medical facilities to receive casualties. His decades of experience in Alaskan waters had taught him to expect the unexpected, but nothing had prepared him for the radio reports describing the bear attack and its aftermath. He maintained constant communication with Coast Guard rescue coordinators, providing updates on weather conditions and landing zone status as the situation continued to evolve. At 7:23 p.m., Coast Guard 6031 lifted off from Providence Medical Center for the return trip to Afognak Island. The 3 casualties from the first evacuation had been rushed directly into surgery, where teams of trauma specialists worked to repair the massive injuries inflicted by the bear attack. Harrison's chest wounds required extensive reconstruction of damaged muscle and lung tissue, while Erickson faced the possibility of leg amputation if circulation couldn't be restored to his mangled limb. Miller's severed arm presented the most complex surgical challenge, as the bear's teeth had created massive tissue damage that extended far beyond the obvious bite wounds. Microsurgeons worked for hours attempting to reconnect severed nerves, blood vessels, and tendons, but the prognosis for full recovery remained uncertain. Each of the 3 men faced months of rehabilitation, even if the initial surgical interventions proved successful. The helicopter's return flight encountered the full fury of the storm system that had been building throughout the day. Wind speeds exceeded 50 miles per hour, with gusts approaching 70, while visibility dropped to near zero in driving rain and fog. Mitchell found herself fighting to maintain control of the aircraft as turbulence tossed the helicopter around like a toy, making precise navigation extremely difficult. Richardson's crew had managed to carry Walsh and Martinez approximately halfway to the beach when they encountered the returning helicopter, which had been forced to land in a small clearing due to deteriorating weather conditions. The pickup location was less than ideal, surrounded by tall trees and subject to dangerous wind patterns, but Mitchell made the decision to attempt the extraction rather than risk having the casualties stranded overnight in the wilderness. The second evacuation proved even more challenging than the first, as ground winds made helicopter handling extremely difficult. Rodriguez and Thompson worked quickly to load Walsh and Martinez, while Mitchell fought to keep the aircraft stable in the gusting winds. At one point, a sudden downdraft caused the helicopter to settle heavily onto its landing gear, nearly resulting in a crash that would have turned the rescue into an even greater disaster. At 8:47 p.m., the helicopter lifted off with the final 2 casualties, beginning what would be the most dangerous flight of Commander Mitchell's career. The storm had reached full intensity, with wind speeds exceeding the helicopter's operational limits and visibility reduced to less than a quarter mile. Ice began forming on the aircraft's rotor blades as they climbed through freezing levels, adding the threat of aerodynamic disruption to the already challenging flight conditions. The flight to Kodiak became a test of skill, equipment, and determination as Mitchell used every technique in her repertoire to keep the helicopter airborne and on course. Radar navigation became essential as visual references disappeared completely in the storm, while autopilot systems struggled to maintain stability in the severe turbulence. Thompson and Rodriguez worked continuously to monitor the casualties' vital signs while fighting their own air sickness in the violently pitching aircraft. Providence Medical Center had activated its trauma protocols and assembled surgical teams to receive the incoming casualties. The hospital's emergency department, normally quiet during evening hours, resembled a combat medical facility as doctors and nurses prepared for the most severe injuries they had seen outside of wartime. Blood banks were activated, surgical suites prepared, and specialist consultants called in from throughout the Kodiak area. At 9:34 p.m., Coast Guard 6031 touched down at the medical center's helipad in conditions that pushed both aircraft and crew beyond their normal operational limits. Walsh and Martinez were rushed directly into surgery, where medical teams began the complex process of repairing the damage inflicted during their terrifying encounter with one of Alaska's most formidable predators. The successful completion of both helicopter flights represented a triumph of skill and courage that had saved 5 lives under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The remaining crew members at the logging site faced a long night of waiting for weather conditions to improve enough for their own evacuation. Richardson maintained regular contact with Coast Guard rescue coordinators and Captain Hendricks, but everyone recognized that further helicopter operations would be impossible until the storm passed. The crew took shelter in the pickup trucks and waited for dawn, surrounded by the evidence of their catastrophic encounter with the massive Kodiak bear. Word of the bear attack spread rapidly through Alaska's close-knit logging community and beyond. News media outlets picked up the story from Coast Guard press releases, and within hours, the attack had become international news as the dramatic rescue operation captured public attention. The fact that 5 experienced loggers had been mauled by a single bear in broad daylight challenged conventional wisdom about bear behavior and wilderness safety protocols. Alaska Department of Fish and Game officials dispatched a team of biologists and enforcement officers to investigate the attack and determine what factors might have contributed to the bear's unusually aggressive behavior. Preliminary examination of the animal's carcass revealed that the bear was indeed a mature male, weighing 1,147 pounds, placing it among the largest Kodiak bears ever documented. More significantly, the bear showed signs of having been involved in previous conflicts with humans, including healed wounds from bullet impacts and evidence of chronic pain from arthritis in its spine and hips. The investigation team, led by senior biologist Dr. Rebecca Thornton, theorized that the bear's previous injuries had made it increasingly irritable and territorial, while chronic pain may have affected its normal fear responses to human activity. This was an exceptional situation involving an exceptional animal, Dr. Thornton explained to media representatives. Kodiak bears of this size are extremely rare, and the combination of factors that led to this attack represents a perfect storm of dangerous conditions. At Providence Medical Center, the 5 attack victims underwent extensive surgical procedures that continued throughout the night and into the following day. Harrison's chest reconstruction required 6 hours of surgery to repair damaged lung tissue and reconstruct muscles torn by the bear's claws. Surgeons were cautiously optimistic about his recovery, though he would require months of rehabilitation and might suffer permanent respiratory limitations. Ericsson's leg presented a more complex challenge as surgeons worked to save the limb from amputation. The bear's bite had crushed the femur into multiple fragments while severing major blood vessels and nerve pathways. Orthopedic specialists used titanium hardware to reconstruct the bone structure, while vascular surgeons restored blood flow to prevent tissue death. The prognosis for full recovery remained uncertain, with the possibility that Ericsson might face permanent disability even if the leg was saved. Miller's severed arm required the most intensive surgical intervention as microsurgeons worked to reconnect the complex network of nerves, blood vessels, tendons and muscles that controlled hand and forearm function. The bear's teeth had created massive trauma that extended far beyond the obvious bite marks, requiring surgeons to essentially rebuild the entire limb from the elbow down. Success rates for such procedures were typically low, and full recovery of hand function was considered unlikely even under the best circumstances. Walsh's punctured lung was successfully repaired, though he faced weeks of recovery as his body healed from the internal injuries caused by his fractured ribs. Martinez's injuries proved less severe than initially feared, consisting primarily of soft tissue damage and psychological trauma from his terrifying battle with the bear atop the bulldozer. Both men were expected to make relatively full recoveries, though the psychological impact of the attack would require long-term counseling and support. Media coverage of the bear attack intensified as details of the rescue operation became public knowledge. Television news crews descended on Kodiak, interviewing hospital officials, Coast Guard personnel, and anyone connected to the dramatic story. The image of an 1,100-pound bear attacking heavy construction equipment captured public imagination and sparked discussions about wilderness safety, wildlife management, and the risks faced by workers in Alaska's remote industries. Commander Sarah Mitchell and her rescue crew became reluctant heroes as their dangerous flights through the storm received widespread recognition. The Coast Guard released helmet camera footage from the rescue operations, showing the challenging conditions and split-second decisions that had saved 5 lives. Mitchell was eventually awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions during the evacuation, while her crew received air medals for their roles in the successful rescue mission. The destroyed bulldozer and Feller Buncher became symbols of the bear's incredible power and the unprecedented nature of the attack. Photographs showing the massive claw marks gouged into steel surfaces appeared in newspapers and magazines around the world, while insurance investigators struggled to classify equipment damage caused by wildlife attack, a scenario not covered by standard industrial policies. Kodiak Lumber Consortium faced significant financial losses from the destroyed equipment, delayed timber harvest, and workers' compensation claims resulting from the attack. Richardson and his surviving crew members were evacuated from the logging site the following morning when weather conditions finally improved enough for helicopter operations. The psychological impact of witnessing such a violent attack affected every member of the crew, with several men requiring extended leave and counseling to cope with post-traumatic stress symptoms. Richardson himself struggled with guilt over his inability to prevent the attack, despite the consensus among investigators that no reasonable precautions could have prevented the encounter with such an unusually aggressive animal. The abandoned logging site became a temporary crime scene, as investigators from multiple agencies worked to reconstruct the events leading to the attack. Fish and game biologists examined the bear's carcass and collected tissue samples for analysis, while Occupational Safety and Health Administration inspectors evaluated the crew's safety procedures and equipment. The investigation revealed that Richardson's crew had followed all established protocols for working in bear country, yet still fell victim to an animal whose behavior defied all previous experience and scientific understanding. Tissue analysis of the bear's carcass revealed elevated levels of stress hormones and evidence of chronic pain conditions that might have affected its behavior patterns. The bear's stomach contents included fish remains and vegetation typical of spring feeding, with no evidence of human food sources that might have attracted it to the logging site. Dental examination showed the wear patterns typical of a bear in its prime, estimated to be between 15 and 20 years old, well within the normal lifespan for Kodiak bears in the wild. The bear's unusual size became a subject of scientific interest as biologists attempted to understand how the animal had achieved such exceptional growth. Genetic analysis suggested the bear was descended from a lineage of particularly large individuals, while environmental factors, including abundant salmon runs and minimal competition from other bears, had allowed it to reach maximum size potential. The combination of superior genetics and optimal environmental conditions had produced what researchers termed a super bear, an individual at the absolute peak of the species' physical capabilities. Recovery for the 5 injured loggers proved to be a long and challenging process that extended far beyond their initial surgical procedures. Harrison spent 3 weeks in intensive care as his body fought to overcome the trauma of his chest injuries, developing pneumonia and other complications that threatened his survival. When he finally stabilized enough for discharge, he faced months of physical therapy to regain lung function and rebuild the muscle strength necessary for normal daily activities. Eriksson's battle to save his leg consumed nearly 2 months of hospitalization as surgeons performed multiple procedures to address complications from his initial injuries. Infection set in around the titanium hardware used to reconstruct his femur, requiring additional surgeries and extended antibiotic treatment that weakened his overall health. Despite the heroic efforts of his medical team, Eriksson was forced to accept that his logging career was over, as his injured leg would never again support the physical demands of professional timber work. Miller faced the greatest challenges of all the attack victims as he struggled to regain function in his reattached arm. Multiple surgeries were required to address nerve damage, circulation problems, and infections that threatened the viability of the reconstructed limb. After 6 months of intensive rehabilitation, Miller had regained some gross motor function in his hand and forearm, but the fine motor control necessary for chainsaw operation was permanently lost. Like Eriksson, he was forced to accept medical retirement and begin the difficult transition to a new career that accommodated his physical limitations. Walsh recovered most completely from his injuries, though he suffered lasting effects from his punctured lung that limited his physical endurance. The psychological trauma of the attack proved more challenging than his physical injuries, as he struggled with anxiety attacks and sleep disturbances that required extensive counseling and medication. Martinez experienced similar psychological effects, finding it impossible to operate heavy equipment without experiencing panic attacks triggered by memories of his battle with the bear atop the bulldozer. The financial impact of the bear attack extended far beyond the immediate medical costs and equipment damage. Workers' compensation claims eventually exceeded $2 million, as the injured men required long-term medical care and disability payments. Kodiak Lumber Consortium faced additional costs from project delays, insurance premium increases, and enhanced safety requirements imposed by regulatory agencies. The company was ultimately forced to implement new protocols for working in bear country that significantly increased operational costs for future logging projects. Legal proceedings related to the bear attack continued for nearly 3 years, as attorneys representing the injured loggers sought compensation from various parties potentially responsible for the incident. Lawsuits were filed against the logging company, equipment manufacturers, and even the state of Alaska for allegedly failing to provide adequate warnings about bear activity in the area. Most cases were eventually settled out of court, with the logging company's insurance carriers paying substantial sums to the attack victims and their families. The attack also prompted changes in Alaska's wildlife management policies, particularly regarding protocols for monitoring and controlling problem bears near industrial work sites. The Department of Fish and Game implemented new requirements for pre-project wildlife surveys and established rapid response teams capable of relocating or eliminating dangerous bears before they could threaten human safety. These changes represented a significant shift in the balance between wildlife conservation and human safety considerations. Scientific studies of the attack and its aftermath provided valuable insights into brown bear behavior under stress conditions. Researchers from the University of Alaska published papers examining the factors that might cause normally reclusive animals to become aggressive toward humans, while wildlife managers developed new models for predicting and preventing similar encounters. The attack became a case study in wildlife management programs worldwide, influencing policies and procedures far beyond Alaska's borders. 5 years after the attack, the logging site on Afognak Island remains abandoned, serving as an unintended monument to one of the most violent wildlife encounters in Alaska's history. The damaged equipment has been removed, but evidence of the bear's rampage is still visible in scarred trees and disturbed earth, where the battle between man and nature reached its violent climax. The site has become a place of pilgrimage for wildlife enthusiasts and researchers studying predator behavior, though access remains restricted due to ongoing safety concerns. The 5 survivors of the March 19th, 2024 bear attack have each found different paths forward from their shared trauma. Harrison eventually returned to work in Alaska's fishing industry, finding that boat-based employment accommodated his reduced lung capacity better than land-based logging work. Erickson relocated to the lower 48 states, where he established a small business providing safety consulting services to logging companies, using his hard-won experience to help prevent similar tragedies. Miller struggled the longest with his recovery, requiring multiple additional surgeries and extensive rehabilitation to maintain function in his damaged arm. He eventually found work as an instructor at a technical college, teaching equipment operation and safety procedures to new generations of loggers. His classroom demonstrations of proper safety protocols carry additional weight due to his visible scars and first-hand knowledge of the consequences when safety measures fail. Walsh and Martinez both left the logging industry entirely, finding that their psychological trauma made it impossible to work comfortably in remote wilderness settings. Walsh became a mechanic in Anchorage, while Martinez found employment with a construction company working on urban projects. Both men continue to receive counseling for post-traumatic stress disorder and maintain contact with their fellow survivors through an informal support network that helps them cope with lasting effects of their encounter with the massive Kodiak bear. The story of the March 19th, 2024 bear attack has become part of Alaska's folklore, joining the ranks of legendary encounters between humans and the state's formidable wildlife. It serves as a reminder that despite all of humanity's technological advances and safety procedures, nature retains the power to humble even the most experienced and well-prepared individuals. The attack also highlighted the courage and skill of Alaska's rescue personnel, whose heroic actions under extreme conditions prevented a tragedy from becoming an even greater catastrophe. Today, the preserved remains of the 1,147-pound Kodiak bear are displayed at the Alaska Wildlife Museum in Anchorage, where they serve as both a scientific specimen and a sobering reminder of nature's awesome power. The bear's massive skull and claws continue to amaze visitors, while educational displays explain the unique circumstances that led to the attack and the heroic rescue efforts that followed. The exhibit has become one of the museum's most popular attractions, drawing visitors from around the world who want to see physical evidence of one of Alaska's most dramatic wildlife encounters. Richardson returned to logging after a brief period of recovery, though he implemented significantly enhanced safety protocols for all future operations in bear country. His experience during the attack made him one of Alaska's most sought-after experts on wilderness safety, and he frequently speaks at industry conferences about lessons learned from the March 19th encounter. He maintains regular contact with his former crew members and has become an advocate for improved workers' compensation benefits for loggers injured in the line of duty. The legacy of the bear attack extends beyond the immediate participants to influence wilderness safety practices throughout North America. The incident prompted reviews of safety protocols in logging, mining, and other industries that operate in remote areas where workers might encounter dangerous wildlife. Equipment manufacturers developed new safety features designed to protect operators from animal attacks, while training programs began incorporating scenarios based on the lessons learned from the Afognak Island encounter. Commander Sarah Mitchell continued her Coast Guard career, eventually rising to the rank of captain and commanding Air Station Kodiak. Her experience during the bear attack rescue operation influenced Coast Guard training programs and equipment specifications, ensuring that future rescue crews would be better prepared for similar challenging operations. The helicopter she flew during the rescue mission, Coast Guard 6031, was eventually retired from active service and is now displayed at the Coast Guard Museum in New London, Connecticut, where it serves as a monument to the bravery of rescue personnel who risk their lives to save others. The March 19, 2024 Kodiak bear attack stands as testament to both the dangers faced by those who work in Alaska's wilderness and the courage of those who risk everything to help their fellow human beings. It reminds us that in the remote corners of our world, the ancient struggle between humans and nature continues, sometimes with tragic consequences that test the limits of human endurance, skill, and determination. The story serves as both a cautionary tale about the risks of working in bear country and an inspiring example of heroism under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. In the years since the attack, wildlife biologists have continued to study the factors that led to such an unprecedented encounter, hoping to develop better methods for preventing similar tragedies. Their research has contributed to our understanding of bear behavior under stress conditions and has helped inform wildlife management decisions throughout North America. The scientific knowledge gained from this tragic incident may ultimately help prevent future attacks and save lives in wilderness areas where humans and large predators share the same habitat. The 5 survivors of the attack have become unwitting ambassadors for wilderness safety, their experiences serving as powerful reminders of both the dangers and the beauty of Alaska's wild places. Their stories of survival, recovery, and resilience continue to inspire others who face seemingly insurmountable challenges, while their advocacy for improved safety measures has helped make wilderness work safer for future generations of loggers, miners, and other outdoor workers. The March 19, 2024 bear attack will long be remembered as one of Alaska's most dramatic wildlife encounters, a day when nature's raw power collided with human determination and courage. The scars left by this encounter, physical, emotional, and psychological, serve as permanent reminders of the price that is sometimes paid for humanity's ongoing relationship with the wilderness. Yet the story also demonstrates the remarkable resilience of the human spirit and the extraordinary lengths to which people will go to save their fellow human beings, even in the face of overwhelming danger and seemingly impossible odds. The next stories. The 3-day hunt, Sarah Michelle Crenshaw had always prided herself on being prepared. At 34, she was a seasoned wilderness photographer who had spent the better part of a decade documenting wildlife across North America's most remote territories. Her weathered Subaru Outback bore the scars of countless backcountry expeditions, scratches from overgrown trail access roads, a cracked windshield from a flying rock in Manitoba, and bumper stickers from every national park she'd worked in, from Yellowstone to Denali. But as she pulled into the gravel parking area at the Glacier Peak Wilderness Trailhead on that crisp morning of September 23rd, 2024, something felt different. The air carried a weight that seemed to press against her chest. and the usual symphony of birdsong that greeted her arrival was conspicuously absent. Sarah stepped out of her vehicle and immediately noticed the temperature. A sharp 42 degrees according to the digital thermometer clipped to her backpack. The overnight frost hadn't fully melted from the windshield, and her breath formed small clouds as she began her methodical equipment check. This ritual had saved her life more times than she could count. Her Canon 5D Mark IV hung around her neck in a weatherproof case, while her backup camera, a lighter mirrorless Sony, sat secured in the top compartment of her pack. 3 extra batteries, 2 memory cards, and a portable solar charger filled designated pockets she could access blindfolded. But photography gear was only part of her arsenal. Sarah's survival kit had been refined through years of trial and error in some of the continent's most unforgiving environments. Her bear spray, 2 canisters of counter-assault, each containing 8 ounces. 1 ounces of 2.0% major capsaicinoids was clipped to her belt and chest harness for immediate access. The safety caps were secured with bright orange tape she'd replace every month, a practice that had become as automatic as checking her phone. Her bear bell, despite the debate among wilderness experts about their effectiveness, jangled softly as she moved. She'd rather announce her presence than surprise something that could kill her. The weather report she'd checked obsessively for the past week had predicted 3 days of ideal conditions: clear skies, temperatures ranging from the low 40s at night to the mid-60s during the day, with minimal wind. Perfect for the assignment that had brought her here, documenting the salmon run in the remote Cascade Creek drainage, where Chinook salmon made their final journey upstream to spawn. The magazine editor at Pacific Northwest Wildlife had been specific about the shots they needed. Wide-angle landscapes showing the creek's relationship to the surrounding peaks, macro detail of the spawning salmon, and if she was lucky, images of the bears that came to feed on this annual abundance. That last requirement had given her pause. Grizzly bears weren't native to this part of Washington, but black bears were numerous, and during salmon runs they could be found in higher concentrations than anywhere else in their territory. Her research had shown that Cascade Creek, fed by glacial melt from the North Cascades, supported one of the healthiest salmon runs in the region. It also meant the creek would be lined with bears, some of whom had been feeding there for weeks. Sarah shouldered her 60-pound pack, feeling the familiar weight distribute across her shoulders and hips. The internal frame backpack, a Gregory Baltoro 75, had been with her for 5 years and fit her 5'6" frame perfectly. Every item had its place. Every piece of gear had been tested in the field. Her sleeping system, rated to 10 degrees below zero, seemed excessive for the predicted conditions, but in the mountains, weather could change in minutes. Her 3-season tent, while heavier than ultralight alternatives, had weathered storms that had collapsed others around her. The trailhead register showed only 2 other parties had signed in during the past week, unusual for this area even in late September. Most hikers avoided Cascade Creek during salmon season specifically because of increased bear activity. That isolation was exactly what Sarah needed for her work, but it also meant she was truly on her own. The nearest cell tower was 45 miles away, and her satellite communicator would be her only link to the outside world if something went wrong. She signed the register with her characteristic precision. Sarah Crenshaw, solo photographer, 3-day permit, Cascade Creek drainage, estimated return September 26th. Her emergency contact information filled the designated lines: her sister Rebecca in Seattle, her editor Marcus at the magazine, and the Whatcom County Sheriff's Department. If she didn't check in by September 27th, search and rescue would be activated. The trail began as a well-maintained path through old-growth Douglas fir and western red cedar. But Sarah knew it would deteriorate rapidly once she left the designated wilderness boundary. For the first 2 miles, the route followed what had once been a logging road. evident from the unnatural straightness and the occasional piece of rusted machinery slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Sword ferns lined the path, their fronds still heavy with morning dew that soaked through her synthetic hiking pants despite their DWR coating. As she hiked, Sarah's photographer's eye automatically catalogued the changing light conditions. The forest canopy filtered the morning sun into cathedral-like shafts that illuminated patches of undergrowth in golden pools. These would make excellent foreground elements for her landscape shots, but she resisted the urge to stop and shoot. The salmon run was time-sensitive. The peak activity would last only a few days, and she needed to reach the creek while the conditions were optimal. Her pace settled into the rhythm she'd developed over years of solo hiking, steady but not rushed, with brief stops every hour to hydrate and check her map and compass. GPS was useful, but in the dense forest canopy, satellite reception could be unreliable. Her topographic map, protected in a waterproof case and marked with waypoints she'd researched for months, remained her primary navigation tool. By 10:30, she'd reached the wilderness boundary marked by a weathered wooden sign and a registration box for overnight permits. Here, the maintained trail ended, replaced by what the Forest Service generously called a primitive path. In reality, it was little more than game trails and occasional cairns marking the route toward Cascade Creek. Sarah paused to study her map again, noting the elevation gain ahead. Nearly 2,000 feet over the next 4 miles, much of it through what topographical lines indicated would be steep, rocky terrain. The transition from maintained trail to wilderness route was immediately apparent. Where before the path had been cleared of obstacles and graded for easy travel, now she found herself climbing over fallen logs, navigating around boulders, and occasionally losing the trail entirely among the dense understory. Her hiking poles became essential tools, providing stability on loose rock and helping her probe for solid ground in areas where years of leaf litter concealed potential hazards. It was during one of these route-finding challenges that Sarah first noticed she wasn't alone in the forest. Fresh scratches on the bark of a large cedar tree caught her attention. 4 parallel gouges, too deep and too high to have been made by anything smaller than a large bear. The marks were recent, the inner wood still showing the pale color that indicated they'd been made within the last few days. She photographed them with her phone, noting the GPS coordinates automatically embedded in the image data. Sarah's heart rate increased as she examined the claw marks more closely. Based on her field experience and the wildlife behavior courses she'd taken, these appeared to be territorial markings rather than feeding sign. Bears often mark trees in areas they considered part of their territory, and the height of these scratches, nearly 8 feet from the ground, suggested a large animal. She made a mental note to be extra vigilant about making noise and stopped to attach a second bear bell to her pack. The next 2 hours of hiking brought her steadily higher into the mountains, with occasional breaks in the forest canopy, providing glimpses of the peaks surrounding Cascade Creek. Mount Baker dominated the northern horizon, its glaciated summit catching the late morning sun. To the east, the jagged spires of the Picket Range created a serrated line against the deep blue sky. These were views that would look spectacular in her final photo essay, but right now they served as important landmarks for navigation. The sound reached her before she saw the creek, a low, constant rumble that grew louder as she descended from a small ridge toward the drainage. Cascade Creek lived up to its name, tumbling down the steep valley in a series of rapids and small waterfalls. But what made Sarah stop in her tracks wasn't the beauty of the water. It was the amount of bear signs surrounding the creek. The muddy banks were crisscrossed with tracks, some so fresh that water was still seeping into the impressions. Large paw prints, some measuring nearly a foot in length, indicated the presence of multiple bears. Scat was everywhere, and not the typical black bear scat she was used to seeing. These were massive deposits filled with salmon scales and bones, indicating animals that had been feeding heavily on fish for some time. Sarah set up her first camp in a clearing about 200 yards from the creek, following every bear safety protocol she'd learned. She selected a site with good visibility in all directions and multiple escape routes. Her food, toiletries, and anything with a scent went into a bear canister that she placed 50 yards downwind from her tent. Her cooking area, another 50 yards away, was positioned so that smoke and food odors wouldn't drift toward her sleeping area. As she worked to establish her base camp, the professional photographer in her began planning shots. The lighting on the creek would be optimal in the early morning and late evening when the sun was low enough to penetrate the forest canopy. The salmon were clearly present. She could see flashes of silver and red in the deeper pools where the fish rested between their upstream battles against the current. But it was the bear activity that both thrilled and terrified her. This was exactly what her editor had hoped for, abundant wildlife in a spectacular natural setting. However, the sheer amount of signs she'd observed suggested a level of bear activity that went beyond anything she'd experienced before. The scratched trees, the numerous tracks, the massive scat deposits all pointed to a concentration of bears that could be dangerous for a solo photographer. Sarah's first afternoon of shooting was productive but tense. Working from concealed positions along the creek, she captured dozens of images of salmon fighting their way upstream. The fish were magnificent, some weighing what appeared to be 30 pounds or more, their bodies showing the dramatic color changes that marked their final journey from ocean to spawning grounds. Their silver ocean coloring had transformed into deep reds and greens, with the males developing the characteristic hooked jaws that would help them defend spawning territories. But with every click of her camera shutter, Sarah remained hyper-aware of her surroundings. The forest seemed unusually quiet, as if the normal wildlife was avoiding the area. Even the Steller's jays, typically raucous and curious about human intrusion, were absent. The only sounds were the constant rush of the creek and occasional splash of jumping salmon. It was just before sunset when Sarah saw her first bear. She was positioned behind a fallen log, about 40 yards from a deep pool where salmon were congregating when movement on the opposite bank caught her eye. A medium-sized black bear emerged from the forest, its nose testing the air before approaching the water. The bear moved with the unhurried confidence of an animal completely comfortable in its environment. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her camera settings for the low-light conditions. This was exactly the shot her editor wanted. A bear in its natural habitat, engaged in natural feeding behavior. She managed to capture several frames of the bear wading into the shallow water, its powerful paws pinning a salmon against the rocky bottom. What happened next changed everything. As Sarah focused through her telephoto lens, she became aware of movement much closer to her position. Another bear, considerably larger than the one she'd been photographing, was approaching through the forest behind her. She hadn't heard it coming. The sound of the creek had masked any noise the animal might have made. The bear was perhaps 25 yards away when Sarah first spotted it, and it had clearly detected her presence. Its massive head was turned in her direction, black nose working to analyze her scent. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She slowly reached for the bear spray on her belt, keeping her movements minimal and avoiding direct eye contact with the animal. For several terrifying minutes, human and bear regarded each other across the forest understory. Sarah could see the animal's size. Easily 300 pounds and possibly much larger. Its coat was thick and glossy black, indicating good health and adequate nutrition. This was not a desperate, hungry bear that might be more inclined to aggression, but it was also clearly an animal accustomed to this territory and possibly protective of its fishing area. The standoff ended when the bear at the creek caught a particularly large salmon, creating enough noise and activity to draw the attention of the bear near Sarah's position. The larger animal moved away through the forest, disappearing as silently as it had arrived. Sarah remained frozen behind her log for another 10 minutes before slowly backing away from the creek toward her camp. That night, Sarah barely slept. Every sound outside her tent, and there were many, sent adrenaline coursing through her system. Sticks breaking, leaves rustling, and what sounded like heavy breathing just outside the thin nylon walls of her shelter kept her in a state of constant alertness. She kept her bear spray and flashlight within reach, and several times nearly activated her satellite communicator to call for an emergency extraction. But dawn brought renewed confidence and spectacular photographic opportunities. The early morning light filtering through the forest canopy created perfect conditions for the landscape shots her editor needed. Sarah worked methodically, capturing wide-angle images that showed the relationship between the creek, the forest, and the surrounding peaks. Her telephoto lens allowed her to document salmon behavior from safe distances, and she even managed several shots of bears fishing, always from concealed positions with multiple escape routes planned. The second day brought more bears and closer encounters. Sarah counted at least 5 different individuals working various sections of the creek, and their behavior suggested they were accustomed to sharing this resource. However, there was clearly a hierarchy among them, with larger bears commanding the best fishing spots, while smaller ones worked the margins. It was late in the afternoon of her second day when Sarah's carefully planned photography session turned dangerous. She had positioned herself on a rocky outcrop about 50 feet above the creek, an elevated position that provided excellent views of a series of pools where salmon were concentrated. Her telephoto lens allowed her to capture intimate details of bear behavior while maintaining what she thought was a safe distance. The bear that changed everything was unlike any she'd seen during her career. Even from her elevated position, she could tell it was massive, easily twice the size of the other bears she'd been photographing. Its coat was darker than the others, almost black-brown, and it moved through the forest with an authority that suggested it was the dominant animal in the area. Sarah was so focused on getting the perfect shot of this magnificent bear that she failed to notice the weather changing around her. The clear skies that had prevailed for 2 days were rapidly giving way to thick clouds, and the temperature was dropping fast. More critically, her concentration on the bear below had caused her to lose track of her surroundings. The first indication that something was wrong came when her camera's autofocus began hunting, unable to lock onto her subject in the rapidly deteriorating light. Sarah looked up from her viewfinder to discover that fog was rolling up the valley, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards. The bear she'd been photographing had disappeared into the mist. What happened next would replay in Sarah's mind for years afterward. As she packed her camera gear and prepared to return to camp, she became aware that she was no longer alone on the rocky outcrop. The massive bear she'd been photographing had somehow climbed the steep slope behind her position and was now between her and the route back to her campsite. The bear was perhaps 15 feet away, clearly aware of her presence, but showing no signs of alarm or aggression. It seemed curious about the strange creature that had been pointing a mechanical device in its direction. Sarah's mouth went dry as she realized the precariousness of her situation. She was trapped on a rocky ledge with a 300-pound-plus bear blocking her exit route, visibility deteriorating rapidly and darkness approaching. Sarah's training told her to avoid direct eye contact, make herself appear smaller, and back away slowly if possible. But there was nowhere to back away to. Behind her was a 40-foot drop to the creek below. Her bear spray was accessible, but using it in the confined space might trap them both in a cloud of capsaicin, with nowhere for either of them to retreat. The bear took a step closer, its massive head swinging from side to side as it processed scents and sounds. Sarah could hear its breathing, deep and regular, and see the individual hairs on its coat moving in the increasing breeze. Every survival instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to remain perfectly still. Minutes passed like hours. The fog continued to thicken, reducing visibility to just a few yards. Sarah could no longer see the creek below or the forest around them. There was only herself, the bear, and the small patch of rocky ground they shared. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees, and she was beginning to shiver despite her layers of clothing. It was the bear that finally broke the stalemate. Perhaps losing interest in the motionless human, or possibly detecting some scent or sound that Sarah couldn't perceive, the animal turned and began working its way down the slope. But instead of taking the route Sarah needed to reach her camp, it headed in the opposite direction, deeper into the forest. Sarah waited another 20 minutes before moving, every nerve on edge as she listened for sounds of the bear's return. When she finally began her descent from the outcrop, the fog was so thick she could barely see her feet. Navigation became a matter of feel and memory as she worked her way down the steep, rocky slope, using her hands as much as her feet. The return to her campsite, normally a 15-minute hike, took nearly 2 hours. Sarah had to stop frequently to check her compass and GPS, both of which were difficult to read in the thick fog. Several times she lost the faint game trail entirely and had to backtrack to find her route. The forest around her was completely silent, except for the distant sound of the creek, creating an eerie atmosphere that had her constantly looking over her shoulder. When she finally reached her camp, Sarah discovered that something had been investigating her absence. Her bear canister showed scratch marks from claws, though the sturdy container had done its job and remained unopened. More concerning were the large paw prints in the mud around her tent, indicating that at least one bear had thoroughly investigated her camping area. That night was even worse than the first. The fog persisted, creating a claustrophobic atmosphere that seemed to muffle all sound. Sarah lay in her sleeping bag, fully clothed, bear spray in hand, listening to what sounded like multiple animals moving around her campsite. Several times she heard what she was certain was breathing just outside her tent, but when she shined her flashlight through the mesh window, she could see nothing in the thick fog. Around 3 in the morning, something large brushed against her tent, causing the entire structure to shake. Sarah's finger found the trigger of her bear spray, but she held off using it, knowing that deploying pepper spray inside her tent would be as dangerous to her as to any bear. Instead, she began talking in a calm, steady voice, the sound seeming to discourage whatever was outside. Dawn couldn't come soon enough. When Sarah finally unzipped her tent to face the third day, she found the fog had lifted somewhat, though visibility was still limited to about 100 yards. More bear tracks surrounded her camp, and she counted what appeared to be prints from at least 3 different animals. One set of tracks was so large that Sarah measured them with her ruler, nearly 11 inches long, suggesting a bear that could weigh 500 pounds or more. Sarah's original plan had called for 3 days of photography, but the events of the previous evening had shaken her confidence. She had gotten excellent shots during the first 2 days, more than enough for the magazine article. Common sense suggested it was time to pack up and hike out while conditions were still manageable. But as she broke down her camp and loaded her backpack, Sarah discovered that leaving might not be as simple as she'd hoped. The fog was patchy but persistent, and she could hear sounds from the direction of the trail that suggested bear activity. Her route out would take her past several areas where she'd observed heavy bear sign, and with limited visibility, the chances of surprising an animal were significantly higher. Sarah made the decision to wait for the fog to lift completely before attempting to leave. She moved her gear to a more open area with better visibility and settled in to wait for conditions to improve. Her satellite communicator showed a strong signal, and she composed a message to her emergency contacts explaining that she was safe but would be delayed by weather. The morning hours passed slowly. Sarah used the time to review and edit her photos, selecting the best images for her article. The shots were spectacular, exactly what her editor had requested. Images of salmon fighting upstream, bears fishing in perfect natural light, and landscape photos that captured the wild beauty of the North Cascades. It had been a successful assignment from a professional standpoint, but the close encounters with bears had pushed her comfort level to its limits. By noon, the fog had thinned enough for Sarah to see the creek and the surrounding forest clearly. She could also see bears, at least 4 individuals fishing various sections of the waterway. Her exit route would take her past 2 areas where bears were actively feeding, presenting a significant challenge. Sarah's solution was to make as much noise as possible as she hiked out. She attached extra bear bells to her pack, sang songs as she walked, and used her hiking poles to tap rocks and trees. The strategy worked. She saw several bears move away from the trail as she approached, clearing her route without confrontation. The hike out took longer than expected due to her cautious pace and frequent stops to scan for wildlife. But by late afternoon, Sarah was back at the trailhead. Her Subaru sat exactly where she'd left it 3 days earlier, covered with a thin layer of frost, but otherwise unchanged. As she loaded her gear, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and accomplishment. She had successfully completed a challenging assignment in difficult conditions and captured some of the best wildlife photos of her career. But the psychological impact of the experience would stay with her for months. The memory of being trapped on the rocky outcrop with the massive bear, the long nights listening to animals investigating her camp, and the constant awareness that she was sharing the forest with predators that could kill her had changed something fundamental in her relationship with wilderness photography. Sarah's drive back to Seattle gave her time to process what had happened. She had always known that wildlife photography involved risks, but the 3 days at Cascade Creek had shown her just how thin the line was between a successful assignment and a potentially fatal encounter. Her preparation and experience had kept her safe, but luck had played a larger role than she was comfortable acknowledging. The magazine editor loved her photos. The images of bears fishing for salmon were featured on the cover of the winter issue, and the accompanying article about the importance of protecting salmon habitat won a regional journalism award. But Sarah found herself declining assignments that would take her into areas with high bear activity. The confidence that had once driven her to seek out the most remote and challenging locations had been replaced by a more cautious approach to risk management. Months later, Sarah would learn that her experience at Cascade Creek had occurred during what wildlife biologists called an exceptional salmon run, one of the largest in recorded history for that drainage. The abundance of fish had attracted bears from a wide area, creating concentrations of wildlife that were far above normal levels. In some ways, she had been unlucky to encounter so many bears in such a confined area. In other ways, her preparation and decision-making had prevented what could have been a tragedy. The Cascade Creek experience taught Sarah that even the most experienced outdoors people could find themselves in situations beyond their control. Weather, wildlife behavior, and simple chance could combine to create dangerous circumstances that no amount of preparation could entirely eliminate. The key was having the skills and equipment to respond appropriately when those situations arose. Sarah continued her career in wildlife photography, but she never again ventured into the field alone during peak wildlife activity periods. She began working with local guides in unfamiliar territory and invested in better communication equipment that would allow her to maintain contact with the outside world, even in remote locations. The 3 days at Cascade Creek had changed her approach to risk, but they had also given her some of the most powerful images of her career. The story of those 3 days became part of Sarah's standard presentation when teaching wilderness photography workshops. She would show the stunning images of bears and salmon while describing the close calls and dangerous moments that had made them possible. Her message to aspiring wildlife photographers was always the same. Preparation and caution were what separated successful photographers from cautionary tales. Years later, Sarah would return to Cascade Creek during a different season when the salmon run was over and bear activity had returned to normal levels. The forest seemed completely different, peaceful and welcoming rather than threatening. She captured beautiful images of the empty creek and frost-covered forest, but they lacked the drama and power of the photos from that memorable September. The creek still carried the scars of the intensive bear activity. Trees with claw marks, depressions in the soil where large animals had bedded down, and scattered bones from consumed salmon. These signs reminded Sarah of just how intense the wildlife activity had been during her original visit, and how fortunate she was to have emerged from the experience unharmed. Sarah's career continued to flourish, built on the reputation established by her Cascade Creek images and the many successful assignments that followed. But she never forgot the lessons learned during those 3 fog-shrouded days when the line between predator and prey had seemed dangerously thin. The experience had taught her that even in an age of advanced technology and instant communication, humans venturing into true wilderness were still subject to natural forces that could humble even the most prepared and experienced outdoors person. The bear spray canisters she'd carried during the Cascade Creek trip remained on her desk as reminders of the importance of preparation. They had never been used, but their presence had provided psychological comfort during the most stressful moments of her career. In the end, Sarah realized, successful wilderness survival often came down to making good decisions under pressure and having the right tools available when they were needed most. The photographs from Cascade Creek would remain among the most powerful images in Sarah's portfolio, not just because of their technical excellence or the dramatic wildlife behavior they captured, but because of the story they represented. They were proof that with adequate preparation, sound judgment, and a healthy respect for the natural world, humans could still venture into truly wild places and return with both memorable images and valuable experiences. But they were also a reminder that wilderness photography, like all forms of interaction with wildlife, required constant vigilance and respect for the animals that called these places home. Sarah had been a visitor in the bear's domain, and her survival had depended on understanding and adapting to their behavioral patterns rather than trying to impose her will on theirs. The 3 days at Cascade Creek had given Sarah more than just photographs. They had given her a deeper understanding of her place in the natural world and a renewed appreciation for the thin margin of safety that exists when humans venture into true wilderness. It was a lesson that would influence every subsequent assignment and help keep her safe during decades of wildlife photography that followed. As Sarah reflected on the experience, she realized that the most important shots she had taken during those 3 days weren't necessarily the ones that appeared in magazines. They were the mental images she carried of moments when her preparation, training, and decision-making had made the difference between a successful assignment and a potential disaster. Those were the shots that reminded her why wilderness photography, despite its risks, remained the most rewarding work she had ever found.